Gaslighting. Gaslighting is a psychological manipulation tactic that makes a person doubt their own memory, perception, emotions, or sense of reality. It does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, through small comments, subtle denials, and repeated distortions of the truth. The goal is not to win an argument, but to gain control over how someone thinks, feels, and trusts themselves. What makes gaslighting especially powerful is that it works quietly, often without the victim realizing what is happening until their confidence is already weakened. At its core, gaslighting works by attacking certainty. Humans rely on their perception of reality to feel safe. When someone repeatedly questions that perception, the brain begins to feel unstable. Statements like, "That never happened," "You're overreacting," "You're remembering it wrong," or "You're too sensitive," may sound harmless on their own. But when used consistently, they create confusion. The person starts asking themselves whether they can trust their own thoughts. Once that trust is damaged, influence becomes much easier. One reason gaslighting is so effective is because humans naturally doubt themselves before they doubt others. Especially in close relationships, people assume the other person is acting in good faith. The brain is wired to preserve relationships, so when there is a conflict between my memory and their confidence, the brain often chooses the path that reduces emotional tension. That path is self-doubt. Over time, this trains the person to rely on the gaslighter's version of reality instead of their own. Gaslighting often includes emotional invalidation. When someone expresses discomfort or concern, the gaslighter reframes it as irrational, dramatic, or unstable. This teaches the person that their emotions are unreliable. Once emotions are dismissed, boundaries weaken. The person stops speaking up, not because they agree, but because they no longer trust their inner signals. This is where gaslighting becomes deeply damaging. It disconnects a person from their intuition. Another key part of gaslighting is inconsistency. The gaslighter may change stories, deny past statements, or contradict themselves, then act as if nothing happened. When confronted, they respond with confidence or annoyance, making the other person feel foolish for questioning them. The brain struggles with inconsistency. It wants clarity. In that confusion, the gaslighter positions themselves as the stable one, even though they are the source of instability. Gaslighting does not require shouting or aggression. In fact, it often works better when delivered calmly. A calm tone paired with denial creates a powerful imbalance. The person being gaslit feels emotional, while the gaslighter appears logical. This contrast reinforces the false idea that one person is rational and the other is not. Over time, the victim may start labeling themselves as confused, too emotional, or bad at remembering things, even if that was never true before. This manipulation can happen in romantic relationships, families, workplaces, friendships, and even on a societal level. In professional environments, gaslighting may look like denying instructions that were given, minimizing concerns, or blaming mistakes on someone else while insisting they are misremembering. In families, it may involve rewriting past events or dismissing a child's emotional experience. In all cases, the effect is the same: erosion of self-trust. One of the most dangerous aspects of gaslighting is that it creates dependency. Once someone doubts their own judgment, they begin seeking validation from the very person who is manipulating them. This creates a loop. The gaslighter causes confusion, then becomes the authority that clarifies reality. The more this cycle repeats, the harder it becomes for the victim to leave or resist. It is important to understand that gaslighting is not simply disagreement. Healthy disagreement allows space for different perspectives. Gaslighting removes that space. It insists that only one version of reality is valid, and that version always benefits the manipulator. The moment someone feels like they must abandon their own perception to maintain peace, gaslighting may be present. Recognizing gaslighting is the first step to breaking its power. Keeping records, trusting patterns over isolated moments, and reconnecting with one's internal sense of truth are key. The manipulation loses strength when reality is anchored outside the gaslighter's control. Gaslighting works because humans value connection, certainty, and trust. It exploits those needs quietly. Understanding it is not about becoming suspicious of everyone, but about protecting the most important reference point you have, your own perception. When that remains intact, gaslighting cannot take hold. Social proof exploitation. Social proof exploitation is a psychological manipulation tactic that takes advantage of one of the strongest instincts in the human brain, the need to belong and to follow what others are doing. Humans are social creatures, and from early survival history, copying the group often meant safety. If many people believed something, chose something, or behaved a certain way, it was usually safer to follow than to stand alone. Social proof exploitation twists this instinct by creating the illusion that everyone else agrees, everyone else is doing it, or this is the normal choice, even when it may not be true. At its simplest level, social proof is harmless. We look at restaurant reviews, ask friends for recommendations, or feel reassured when others confirm a decision. But when exploited, social proof becomes a tool for influence and control. The manipulator does not rely on logic, facts, or personal benefit. Instead, they rely on numbers, popularity, or perceived consensus. The message becomes, "You should believe this or do this because others already have." The brain responds strongly to this because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. When faced with a decision, especially a complex or emotional one, the brain looks for shortcuts. One of the fastest shortcuts is social validation. If many people seem to agree, the brain relaxes. It assumes the decision is safe. Exploiters know this and deliberately manufacture or exaggerate agreement to bypass critical thinking. One common form of social proof exploitation is the use of everyone language. Phrases like, "everyone knows," "most people think," "no one does it that way anymore," or "people like you usually choose this," are designed to trigger conformity. Even without evidence, the brain fills in the gap. It assumes there must be a group consensus, and it doesn't want to be the odd one out. Another form involves numbers and visibility. Likes, shares, followers, testimonials, reviews, crowds, queues, or popularity rankings all function as social proof. When people see large numbers, the brain interprets them as trust signals. The manipulator may inflate numbers, selectively show positive feedback, or hide dissent. The illusion of popularity becomes more persuasive than the actual value of the idea or product. Social proof exploitation is especially powerful in situations involving fear, uncertainty, or identity. When people feel unsure of themselves, they look outward for guidance. The manipulator positions the group as the authority. The individual feels pressure to align, not because the choice is right, but because deviation feels risky. The fear is not always logical, it is emotional. It is the fear of rejection, judgment, or isolation. Another subtle tactic is peer comparison. Statements like, "people your age are already doing this," or "others in your position have moved on," imply that staying where you are is wrong or backward. The brain feels social pressure to keep up. This technique is often used in marketing, workplaces, and relationships to rush decisions or silence doubts. Social proof exploitation also works by silencing disagreement. When a manipulator frames an idea as widely accepted, dissent feels embarrassing. People hesitate to speak up because they assume they are wrong. This creates a feedback loop. Silence is mistaken for agreement, and agreement strengthens the illusion of consensus. Over time, individuals begin doubting their own thoughts simply because they appear to be alone. This tactic can appear in friendships, workplaces, families, online communities, politics, and media. In a workplace, it might sound like everyone agrees this is the best approach, even when no discussion happened. In relationships, it may sound like any reasonable person would see this my way. In all cases, the manipulator removes individuality and replaces it with group pressure. What makes social proof exploitation dangerous is that it bypasses personal values. Instead of asking, "Is this right for me?" the brain is pushed to ask, "What will happen if I don't go along?" the decision shifts from internal judgment to external approval. Over time, this weakens confidence and autonomy. It is important to understand that disagreement does not mean you are wrong, and popularity does not equal truth. History is full of widely accepted ideas that were later proven false. Social proof feels convincing because it speaks to survival instincts, not because it guarantees correctness. Recognizing this manipulation requires slowing down, asking simple questions like, who exactly is everyone? Where is the evidence? Would I believe this if no one else were mentioned? Helps restore clarity. When decisions are grounded in values and evidence instead of group pressure, social proof loses its power. Social proof exploitation works because humans fear isolation more than error. Understanding it allows you to reclaim independent thought and remember that consensus is not the same as truth, and popularity is not the same as wisdom. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a psychological effect that happens when the first piece of information we encounter becomes a reference point, or anchor, that strongly influences how we judge everything that comes after it. Even when the initial information is irrelevant, random, or intentionally misleading, the brain still uses it as a baseline. This bias works quietly and automatically, shaping decisions, opinions, and perceptions without us realizing it. What makes anchoring bias especially powerful is that knowing about it does not fully protect you from it. The human brain is designed to work efficiently, not perfectly. When faced with decisions, especially under uncertainty, the brain looks for shortcuts to reduce mental effort. An anchor provides that shortcut. Once an initial number, idea, label, or expectation is introduced, the brain latches onto it and adjusts away from it only slightly, instead of evaluating the situation from scratch. This happens because starting from zero requires more energy, time, and cognitive effort. Anchoring bias appears most clearly with numbers, but it also affects opinions, expectations, and judgments. For example, if someone mentions a high price first, any lower price that follows feels reasonable by comparison, even if it is still expensive. The first number sets the mental scale. The brain does not ask, is this price fair? It asks, is this lower than the anchor? That small shift in question changes everything. This bias works because the brain interprets the first information as meaningful, even when it shouldn't. Once the anchor is set, the brain subconsciously treats it as a starting truth. Any later information is filtered through that frame. Even when people are told the anchor is random, it still influences them. This shows that anchoring bias operates below conscious control. Anchoring bias is frequently used in negotiations, marketing, and persuasion. In negotiations, the person who sets the first number often controls the range of discussion. Even if the other person disagrees, their counteroffer usually stays closer to the initial anchor than they realize. The first number silently defines what feels normal or reasonable. In everyday life, anchoring bias affects how we judge people, situations, and ourselves. First impressions act as anchors. If someone is introduced as very intelligent, their mistakes may be overlooked. If they are introduced negatively, their positive traits may be discounted. The initial label shapes interpretation. The brain seeks consistency with the anchor, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Anchoring bias also influences self-perception. If someone once received criticism or a low evaluation, that judgment can become an internal anchor. Even years later, the person may measure themselves against that outdated reference point. The anchor continues shaping confidence and self-worth long after it should have lost relevance. Another reason anchoring bias is so effective is because adjustment away from the anchor feels sufficient to the brain. The mind believes it has corrected enough, but in reality, it has not moved far enough. This creates a false sense of objectivity. People believe they are thinking independently while still being heavily influenced by the initial reference. Anchors do not need to be logical or accurate. They only need to be present first. A random number, an offhand comment, a suggested range, or even a visual cue can function as an anchor. Once planted, it subtly guides thought. This makes anchoring bias particularly dangerous in situations where information is incomplete or emotional because the brain leans more heavily on the anchor for stability. This bias also explains why comparisons are so powerful. Humans do not judge things in isolation. They judge relative to what came before. Anchors define the comparison frame. Without realizing it, people are guided to conclusions that feel rational but are actually shaped by context. Anchoring bias is not a sign of low intelligence. Highly intelligent people experience it just as strongly. It is a feature of human cognition, not a flaw of certain individuals. The brain evolved to make fast judgments in uncertain environments, and anchors helped early humans make quick decisions. In modern contexts, however, this same mechanism is often exploited. Reducing the impact of anchoring bias requires slowing down decision-making and consciously questioning the first information received. Asking, "Would my judgment be different if this were not the first thing I heard?" helps weaken the anchor's hold. Seeking independent reference points and delaying conclusions also helps, but the bias never disappears completely. Anchoring bias shows how much the human mind depends on context. It reveals that decisions are rarely made from a neutral starting point. Understanding this bias does not make you immune, but it gives you awareness. And awareness is the first step toward reclaiming control over how judgments are formed. Time pressure. Time pressure is a psychological manipulation tactic that works by creating the feeling that time is running out, forcing a person to act before they are ready. It does not rely on persuasion through logic or evidence. Instead, it targets the nervous system. When people feel rushed, their ability to think critically drops, emotions take over, and decisions become reactive rather than reflective. Time pressure is powerful because it bypasses reasoning and goes straight to survival instincts. At a biological level, humans are not designed to make good decisions under urgency. When the brain senses a time limit, it interprets it as a potential threat. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol increase, narrowing attention and speeding up reactions. This response evolved to help humans survive danger, not to evaluate complex choices. Under pressure, the brain prioritizes speed over accuracy. The manipulator exploits this by shrinking the window for reflection. Time pressure often appears in phrases like, "You need to decide now," "This offer expires today," "Last chance," "Hurry before it's gone," or "If you don't act immediately, you'll miss out." These statements don't necessarily provide new information. They create urgency. The brain focuses on the risk of loss instead of the quality of the decision. Fear becomes the driver. One reason time pressure works so well is because humans hate regret. The idea of missing an opportunity feels worse than making a suboptimal choice. Under pressure, the brain shifts from asking, "Is this right for me?" to "What if I don't act and lose this?" This fear of missing out pushes people to say yes, agree, buy, comply, or commit before they fully understand what they're doing. Time pressure also disrupts boundary setting. When people feel rushed, they struggle to say no. Saying no requires confidence and mental space. Urgency removes that space. The manipulator benefits because hesitation disappears. The person complies just to end the pressure and regain emotional relief. Another key element is artificial urgency. In many cases, the time limit is not real. The situation could wait, the offer could return, or the decision could be postponed safely. But the manipulator frames it as irreversible. The brain does not verify this claim under stress. It accepts the urgency as truth because the emotional signal is stronger than logic. Time pressure is often paired with other manipulation tactics. It frequently appears alongside false scarcity, social proof, or authority pressure. For example, everyone else already agreed, and you're the last one who needs to decide. This compounds stress. The brain becomes overloaded and defaults to compliance. In relationships, time pressure may sound like, "Decide now or I'm leaving," or "If you cared, you wouldn't need time to think." This reframes reflection as rejection. The person feels guilty for wanting space. They are pushed into emotional decisions that favor the manipulator's needs, not mutual understanding. In workplaces, time pressure may appear as sudden deadlines, rushed approvals, or last-minute demands. The person feels they cannot ask questions without seeming difficult. Mistakes increase, boundaries weaken, and responsibility shifts unfairly. What makes time pressure especially dangerous is that it creates the illusion of choice while removing the conditions needed for real choice. Technically, the person is deciding, but psychologically, they are reacting. The manipulator controls the pace, and pace controls power. Another reason time pressure works is because it interrupts self-trust. People often sense that something feels off, but urgency silences that signal. The internal voice that says, "Wait," gets overridden by the fear of delay. Over time, repeated exposure to time pressure can train a person to doubt their instinct to pause, making them easier to manipulate in the future. It is important to understand that urgency does not equal importance. Truly important decisions usually benefit from time, not haste. Pressure to rush is often a sign that someone does not want you to think too carefully. Resisting time pressure begins with recognizing it. The moment you feel rushed, that feeling itself is information. Slowing down, asking for time, or stepping away immediately weakens the tactic. A decision that cannot survive a pause is rarely a decision made in your best interest. Time pressure works because the human brain values safety, relief, and certainty under stress. It exploits the fear of loss and the discomfort of uncertainty. Understanding this tactic restores your right to move at your own pace. When you control time, you regain clarity, and clarity is the enemy of manipulation. False scarcity. False scarcity is a psychological manipulation tactic that creates the illusion that something is rare, limited, or about to disappear, even when it is not. The goal is not to inform, but to rush. By making people believe they are facing a shortage, the manipulator pushes them to act quickly, emotionally, and without careful evaluation. This tactic works because the human brain is deeply wired to fear loss more than it values gain. When something feels scarce, it automatically feels more valuable. At a basic level, scarcity triggers survival instincts. For most of human history, resources were limited. Food, shelter, protection, and social belonging could disappear quickly. The brain learned that hesitation could mean loss. That wiring still exists. When the brain perceives scarcity, it shifts into protection mode. Logic weakens, urgency increases, and the focus narrows to one thought. If I don't act now, I lose. False scarcity exploits this instinct by presenting a situation as limited when it is not truly limited. Phrases like, "only a few left," "last chance," "offer ends tonight," "exclusive access," or "limited availability" are classic examples. These statements may be technically true in a small sense or completely fabricated, but their real purpose is emotional pressure. The brain does not stop to verify. It reacts. One reason false scarcity is so effective is because it reframes decision-making. Instead of asking, "Do I need this?" or "Is this right for me?" the brain asks, "What if I miss out?" Fear replaces evaluation. The decision becomes about avoiding regret rather than choosing wisely. This is why people buy things they don't need, agree to commitments they later regret, or accept conditions they wouldn't normally tolerate. False scarcity also creates perceived competition. When something is framed as scarce, the brain imagines others racing to claim it. This activates comparison and status instincts. The thought becomes, if others get it and I don't, I fall behind. Even when there is no real competition, the illusion is enough to trigger compliance. Another layer of false scarcity is control of time. Scarcity is often paired with deadlines. Time limits amplify pressure. The person feels trapped between acting fast or losing forever. The brain dislikes irreversible loss, so it chooses action over reflection. The manipulator benefits because rushed decisions favor the person who controls the narrative. False scarcity is commonly used in marketing, sales, negotiations, relationships, and even workplaces. In business, it may appear as fake low stock warnings, countdown timers that reset, or exclusive offers sent to millions of people. In relationships, it may sound like, "You're my only chance," or "This opportunity won't come again," creating emotional dependency. In workplaces, it may appear as, "If you don't take this now, it won't be available later," even when no real deadline exists. What makes false scarcity especially dangerous is that it suppresses intuition. Many people feel a subtle sense of discomfort when pressured, but scarcity reframes that discomfort as excitement or urgency. The internal warning system gets confused. The brain mistakes stress for importance. False scarcity also increases perceived value without increasing real value. The object, opportunity, or person does not change. Only the framing changes, but because the brain equates rarity with worth, the desire intensifies. This is why limited editions, exclusivity, and members-only access feel more appealing, even when the product or situation is identical to widely available alternatives. Another reason this tactic works is because humans dislike indecision. Scarcity simplifies the choice. Instead of many options, the brain sees one shrinking option. This reduces cognitive load, making compliance feel relieving. Acting quickly ends the tension. It is important to understand that real scarcity and false scarcity are different. Real scarcity exists when resources are genuinely limited and transparent. False scarcity exists when limitation is exaggerated, manipulated, or manufactured to control behavior. The harm comes from deception, not from limitation itself. Recognizing false scarcity requires slowing down. Asking questions like, "What happens if I wait? Who benefits if I rush?" and "Would I want this without the deadline?" helps restore clarity. True value does not disappear simply because time passes. False scarcity works because it hijacks fear, urgency, and the desire to avoid regret. It replaces thoughtful choice with reactive behavior. Understanding it restores your ability to pause. And when you can pause, you can choose based on value instead of pressure. The silent treatment. The silent treatment is a psychological manipulation tactic where one person deliberately withdraws communication to punish, control, or destabilize another. It is not simply taking space or cooling down after conflict. The key difference is intent. The silent treatment is used to create discomfort, insecurity, and emotional imbalance in the other person. Silence becomes a weapon. By refusing to speak, respond, or acknowledge, the manipulator forces the other person into a state of uncertainty and distress. Humans are wired for connection. Our brains interpret sudden social withdrawal as a threat. From an evolutionary standpoint, being ignored by the group meant danger, isolation, and loss of protection. The silent treatment activates this ancient fear. When communication is cut off without explanation, the nervous system reacts immediately. Anxiety rises, thoughts spiral, and the brain searches desperately for meaning. The person begins asking, "What did I do wrong? How do I fix this? Am I about to lose this relationship?" That internal chaos is exactly what gives the silent treatment its power. One reason the silent treatment is so effective is that it removes clarity. There is no argument to resolve, no words to respond to, no clear problem to address. The person on the receiving end cannot defend themselves or correct misunderstandings because they do not know what the issue is. The lack of information forces the brain to fill the gaps, often with self-blame. Silence creates a vacuum, and the mind fills it with fear. Another core mechanism at work is control. The person using the silent treatment controls when communication resumes, on what terms, and with what emotional tone. The other person is left waiting. This imbalance of power shifts the dynamic. The silent person becomes the authority, and the other becomes the seeker. Over time, this can train the recipient to change their behavior just to avoid being ignored again. Compliance becomes a way to restore connection. The silent treatment also works by withholding emotional validation. Humans rely on feedback from others to regulate emotions. When someone suddenly withholds acknowledgement, eye contact, or basic responsiveness, it destabilizes emotional balance. The person feels invisible. This can be especially damaging in close relationships, where emotional safety depends on communication. Silence can also be used to rewrite reality. By refusing to engage, the manipulator avoids accountability. They do not have to explain their actions or face consequences. If the other person brings up concerns later, the manipulator may minimize them or deny intent, framing the silence as needing space or not wanting conflict. This blurs responsibility and shifts guilt onto the person who was harmed. In workplaces, the silent treatment may appear as ignoring emails, excluding someone from conversations, or withholding information. This creates confusion and self-doubt while allowing the manipulator to maintain plausible deniability. In families or romantic relationships, it may look like days of coldness, avoidance, or emotional shutdown, often without explanation. The effect is the same: emotional punishment without direct confrontation. What makes the silent treatment especially harmful is that it attacks attachment needs. People who value connection, harmony, and emotional closeness are more vulnerable to it. The fear of losing the relationship pushes them to apologize, even when they did nothing wrong, or to suppress their needs to restore peace. Over time, this erodes self-worth and teaches the person that their voice causes abandonment. It is important to distinguish the silent treatment from healthy boundaries. Taking time to calm down is communicated clearly and includes reassurance. The silent treatment includes no reassurance. It leaves the other person guessing. Healthy space seeks resolution. The silent treatment seeks control. Another dangerous aspect is that silence can feel socially acceptable. Because no harsh words are spoken, the behavior can be dismissed as passive or harmless. But emotionally, it can be as damaging as verbal aggression. The absence of words does not mean the absence of impact. The silent treatment often works in cycles. Silence is applied. The other person becomes anxious and reaches out. Communication resumes only after compliance, apology, or submission. This reinforces the manipulator's strategy. Each cycle strengthens the association between obedience and relief. Breaking the power of the silent treatment requires recognizing it as a tactic, not a misunderstanding. Seeking clarity, refusing to chase reassurance, and setting boundaries around communication are essential. Silence loses its power when it no longer controls behavior. The silent treatment works because humans crave connection more than certainty. It exploits emotional dependency and fear of loss. Understanding it restores agency. Communication should be a bridge, not a weapon. When silence is used to control, it reveals more about the manipulator than the person being ignored. Guilt tripping. Guilt tripping is a psychological manipulation tactic that works by making someone feel responsible for another person's emotions, discomfort, disappointment, or suffering, even when that responsibility is unfair or exaggerated. Instead of asking directly for what they want, the manipulator uses guilt as leverage. The goal is not understanding or compromise, but compliance. When guilt tripping is effective, the person being targeted agrees, apologizes, or gives in, not because they truly want to, but because they feel emotionally cornered. At its core, guilt tripping exploits empathy. Humans are wired to care about others. We feel distress when we believe we've hurt someone, let them down, or failed morally. Guilt is a powerful emotion designed to help maintain social harmony and repair relationships. Manipulators take advantage of this healthy mechanism by activating guilt where it does not truly belong. They redirect responsibility from themselves onto the other person. Guilt tripping often sounds subtle. Phrases like, "After everything I've done for you, I guess I'll just handle it alone. I didn't expect this from you," or "If you really cared, you would," are common examples. These statements do not clearly state a need or boundary. Instead, they imply moral failure. The brain immediately shifts into self-evaluation mode, searching for how it may have done something wrong. One reason guilt tripping is so effective is that it creates emotional imbalance. The person being guilt-tripped feels discomfort, while the manipulator positions themselves as the injured party. This flips the power dynamic. The targeted person feels pressure to restore balance by apologizing, giving in, or sacrificing their own needs. Relief only comes after compliance, which reinforces the behavior. Another mechanism at play is fear of rejection. Guilt tripping often implies emotional withdrawal if compliance does not occur. The unspoken message is, if you don't do this, you are a bad person and our relationship will suffer. Humans fear relational loss deeply. The brain prioritizes connection over fairness, especially in close relationships. This makes guilt tripping especially powerful in families, friendships, and romantic partnerships. Guilt tripping also works by blurring boundaries. The manipulator does not respect the difference between their feelings and the other person's responsibility. They act as if discomfort automatically equals blame. Over time, this teaches the other person that having boundaries causes harm. Saying no begins to feel morally wrong, even when it is necessary or reasonable. In many cases, guilt tripping relies on exaggeration or selective memory. The manipulator highlights sacrifices they made while ignoring context, consent, or past support they received. This creates a distorted emotional ledger where the other person is always in emotional debt. The brain, wanting to be fair, tries to repay this imagined debt through compliance. Guilt tripping can also be passive. Silence, sighs, disappointment, or martyr-like behavior can communicate guilt without words. The manipulator does not have to accuse directly. They simply display suffering and let the other person fill in the meaning. This indirect approach is powerful because it feels harder to confront. The targeted person feels cruel for questioning it. Over time, repeated guilt tripping can erode self-trust. The person begins to doubt their right to their own needs, time, and limits. They may become hyper-aware of others' emotions and neglect their own. This can lead to chronic people-pleasing, resentment, burnout, and anxiety. The manipulation succeeds not by force, but by emotional exhaustion. It is important to distinguish guilt tripping from healthy accountability. Healthy accountability is specific, respectful, and open to dialogue. Guilt tripping is vague, emotionally loaded, and designed to shut down discussion. It does not seek understanding, it seeks control. Guilt tripping appears in many contexts. In families, it may involve parental sacrifice being used as leverage. In relationships, it may involve love being tied to compliance. In workplaces, it may involve loyalty or team spirit being used to pressure extra work. In all cases, the emotional cost is shifted onto the person least able to resist. Breaking free from guilt tripping requires recognizing that feeling guilty does not automatically mean you are wrong. Guilt is a signal, not a verdict. Asking, "What am I actually responsible for?" helps separate true accountability from emotional manipulation. Clear communication and boundaries weaken the tactic because guilt tripping thrives on ambiguity. Guilt tripping works because humans care deeply about being good, kind, and fair. It exploits those values. Understanding it allows you to keep your empathy without surrendering your autonomy. You can care without being controlled, and when guilt is no longer weaponized, relationships become clearer, healthier, and more honest. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when a person holds two or more conflicting beliefs, values, emotions, or behaviors at the same time. This internal conflict creates mental discomfort, tension, or unease. The human brain strongly dislikes this feeling, so it instinctively tries to reduce it. What makes cognitive dissonance especially important in dark psychology is that this discomfort can be exploited to influence beliefs, decisions, and behavior without direct force or persuasion. At its core, cognitive dissonance is about inconsistency. Humans like to see themselves as logical, coherent, and morally consistent. When reality challenges that self-image, the brain experiences stress. For example, if someone believes they are a good person but behaves in a way that contradicts that belief, the mind feels pressure to resolve the contradiction. That resolution does not always involve changing behavior. Often, it involves changing the story we tell ourselves. The brain has several ways to reduce cognitive dissonance. One is justification. Instead of admitting a mistake, the brain explains it away. Another is denial, where uncomfortable facts are ignored or minimized. A third is belief adjustment, where values are subtly shifted to align with behavior. The key point is that the brain prioritizes emotional comfort over objective truth. This makes cognitive dissonance a powerful lever for manipulation. Manipulators exploit cognitive dissonance by guiding someone into a small commitment or belief, then slowly increasing inconsistency. Once a person has publicly committed to an idea, action, or identity, backing out becomes psychologically painful. The brain wants to remain consistent. To avoid discomfort, the person adapts their beliefs to justify what they have already done. The manipulator does not need to convince them further. The person convinces themselves. This is why cognitive dissonance is often used in gradual manipulation. It rarely starts with something extreme. It starts with something small and reasonable. Once the person agrees, saying no later feels harder. The internal dialogue becomes, "I already agreed before, so this must still be right." Each step locks the person in deeper, not because of logic, but because of the desire to stay consistent. Cognitive dissonance also explains why people defend beliefs even when presented with clear evidence against them. Admitting error would threaten identity, self-image, or past decisions. The brain protects itself by rejecting information, attacking the source, or reframing reality. This is not stupidity. It is psychological self-defense. In relationships, cognitive dissonance can be exploited by alternating harmful behavior with justifications or affection. The person thinks, "They hurt me, but they also care about me." That contradiction creates discomfort. To reduce it, the brain may minimize the harm or exaggerate the positive moments. The dissonance keeps the person stuck, trying to make sense of conflicting experiences instead of leaving. In workplaces or authority structures, cognitive dissonance may appear when people are asked to act against their values just this once. After complying, the brain shifts beliefs to match behavior. Over time, actions that once felt wrong begin to feel normal. The manipulation works not by force, but by letting the mind do the work of rationalization. Cognitive dissonance is especially powerful because it is internal. The manipulator does not need to argue or pressure constantly. Once the dissonance is triggered, the brain becomes its own enforcer. The person seeks consistency on their own, often moving closer to the manipulator's desired outcome. Another reason this mechanism is so effective is that humans confuse consistency with integrity. Staying consistent feels morally good. Changing one's mind feels like weakness, even when it is healthy. Manipulators exploit this by framing doubt as failure or betrayal. The person clings to the original commitment to protect their self-image. It is important to understand that cognitive dissonance is not inherently bad. It can also drive growth. When faced honestly, it can lead to learning, value clarification, and positive change. The danger appears when dissonance is deliberately induced and guided towards self-deception rather than reflection. Breaking the power of cognitive dissonance requires slowing down and allowing discomfort without immediately resolving it. Asking questions like, "Am I changing my belief to fit my behavior?" Or, "Would I make the same choice again if I were starting fresh?" helps restore clarity. Accepting that changing one's mind is not failure weakens the manipulation. Cognitive dissonance works because humans want to see themselves as consistent, good, and rational. It exploits identity more than logic. Understanding it gives you back the ability to tolerate discomfort without distorting reality. When you can sit with inconsistency long enough to examine it, manipulation loses its grip. Priming. Priming is a psychological influence technique that works by subtly shaping how the brain interprets information, reacts emotionally, and makes decisions without the person realizing they are being influenced. It does not tell someone what to think directly. Instead, It prepares the mind in advance. By exposing someone to certain words, images, ideas, emotions, or contexts beforehand, priming nudges their thoughts and behavior in a predictable direction later. What makes priming powerful in dark psychology is that it operates below conscious awareness, bypassing critical thinking almost entirely. The human brain is constantly predicting what comes next. To do this efficiently, it relies on associations. When the brain encounters a stimulus, it activates related concepts automatically. Priming takes advantage of this mechanism. If the mind is exposed to a certain idea first, it becomes more accessible, more familiar, and more likely to influence interpretation of what follows. The person believes they are reacting freely, but their mental landscape has already been shaped. Priming works because the brain does not reset between moments. Every experience slightly alters perception. Words, colors, tones, environments, and emotions leave traces. These traces affect how later information is processed. For example, if someone is exposed to ideas related to danger, their brain becomes more alert and suspicious. If they are exposed to ideas related to success, warmth, or trust, they become more open and agreeable. The influence feels natural because the brain assumes its reactions are self-generated. One reason priming is so effective is that it feels invisible. People are rarely aware of what influenced their mood or judgment. They attribute their reactions to logic or personal preference, not to prior exposure. This creates a false sense of independence. The mind believes it chose freely, when in reality the choice was gently guided. Priming can influence emotions, judgments, memory, and behavior. Exposure to certain words can make people more cooperative or more aggressive. Certain images can increase trust or fear. Even subtle environmental cues like lighting, music, or colors can prime emotional states. Once primed, the brain is more likely to interpret neutral information in line with the activated concept. In manipulation contexts, priming is often used before persuasion. The manipulator introduces themes or emotional tones before making a request or presenting an idea. For example, they may first evoke insecurity, urgency, or scarcity, then present a solution. The brain, already primed emotionally, is more likely to accept the solution without resistance. The influence feels intuitive, not forced. Priming is especially powerful when people are distracted, tired, stressed, or emotionally open. In these states, the brain relies more heavily on automatic processing rather than deliberate analysis. This makes priming harder to detect and easier to exploit. The person reacts quickly, guided by whatever mental pathways were activated first. Another important aspect of priming is repetition. The more often a concept is subtly introduced, the more familiar it feels. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort is often mistaken for truth or safety. Over time, repeated priming can shape attitudes and beliefs without ever presenting a clear argument. This is why certain narratives, slogans, or emotional frames are repeated so often in advertising, media, and influence campaigns. Priming also affects self-perception. If someone is repeatedly exposed to messages that emphasize inadequacy, failure, or comparison, they may begin to see themselves through that lens. Their decisions then align with that primed identity. Conversely, priming confidence or competence can increase assertiveness and performance. The technique itself is neutral. Its ethical impact depends on intent. In relationships, priming may involve setting emotional tones before conversations. Someone might create guilt, fear, or obligation first, then ask for compliance. The person feels compelled to agree, not because the request makes sense, but because the emotional state was prepared in advance. The manipulation succeeds quietly. What makes priming dangerous in dark psychology is that it removes informed consent. The person is influenced without knowing influence occurred. There is no clear moment to resist. The manipulation happens before awareness can engage. Priming is not inherently harmful. It is used positively in therapy, education, and motivation. The harm appears when it is used to limit autonomy, distort perception, or push behavior against someone's best interest. Resisting priming requires awareness and slowing down, asking, "Why do I feel this way right now? And what happened just before this thought?" helps interrupt automatic responses. Creating space between stimulus and decision weakens the effect. When attention becomes conscious, priming loses much of its power. Priming works because the brain is associative, predictive, and efficient. It prefers continuity over neutrality. Understanding this technique restores choice. When you recognize that your thoughts may have been prepared in advance, you regain the ability to question where they came from. And that questioning is the beginning of true autonomy. Repetition hypnosis. Repetition hypnosis is a psychological influence tactic that works by repeating the same message, idea, or narrative until the brain begins to accept it as true, familiar, or normal. It does not rely on strong arguments or evidence. Instead, it relies on exposure. The more often something is repeated, the more believable it feels, even when it is inaccurate or misleading. This happens because the human brain equates familiarity with safety and truth, and repetition creates familiarity faster than logic can intervene. The brain is designed to conserve energy. Constantly analyzing every piece of information would be exhausting, so the mind uses shortcuts. One of the strongest shortcuts is familiarity. When the brain encounters the same idea repeatedly, it becomes easier to process. This ease is interpreted as correctness. The thought feels smooth, effortless, and comfortable, so the brain assumes it must be valid. Repetition hypnosis exploits this mechanism by replacing critical thinking with mental ease. What makes repetition hypnosis especially powerful is that it works even when people know it exists. Simply hearing something many times increases the chance that it will be believed. The brain remembers the message but forgets the source. Over time, the mind recalls the idea without recalling whether it was proven, questioned, or even reliable. The message detaches from its origin and floats freely as something I know. Repetition hypnosis often begins subtly. A phrase, belief, or framing is introduced casually. It may not seem important at first, but it is repeated again and again in slightly different forms, contexts, or tones. Each repetition strengthens neural pathways associated with the idea. Eventually, the brain no longer evaluates it. It accepts it automatically. The idea becomes background truth. This tactic is especially effective when repetition comes from multiple sources. When the same message appears in conversations, media, authority figures, social groups, or online spaces, the brain interprets it as consensus. Even if the sources are connected or biased, the mind registers volume, not independence. Quantity replaces quality. Repetition hypnosis is often used to normalize behavior or beliefs that might otherwise feel uncomfortable. The first exposure may cause resistance. The second causes curiosity. The third causes neutrality. Eventually, acceptance follows. The brain adapts not because it was convinced, but because resistance requires effort, and effort feels unnecessary when something is constantly reinforced. Emotion also plays a role. Repetition paired with emotional language is even more powerful. Fear, reassurance, urgency, or moral framing accelerates acceptance. When emotion is involved, the brain prioritizes speed over accuracy. Repeated emotional messages bypass rational filters and sink deeper into memory. In relationships, repetition hypnosis may sound like repeated comments about someone's flaws, abilities, or responsibilities. Over time, the person internalizes these messages, even if they initially disagreed. The repetition shapes identity. In workplaces, repeated narratives about performance, loyalty, or expectations can redefine what feels normal. In society, repeated slogans or simplified explanations can shape collective belief. Another reason repetition hypnosis works is that humans confuse repetition with reflection. When a thought appears often, it feels important. The brain assumes, if I keep thinking this, it must matter. But the repetition may not come from truth. It may come from exposure. The mind mistakes frequency for significance. Repetition hypnosis is especially effective when people are tired, stressed, distracted, or emotionally invested. In these states, the brain relies more on automatic processing. Repeated messages slip past defenses. The person believes they arrived at the conclusion independently, unaware that the path was guided. Over time, repetition can even override direct experience. A person may believe something repeated often enough, even if it contradicts what they have personally observed. This happens because the brain values social consistency and mental comfort. Challenging a familiar belief creates cognitive strain, so the mind avoids it. Importantly, repetition hypnosis does not require lies. Even partial truths or selective framing can be repeated until they become misleading. What is emphasized repeatedly becomes dominant, while what is omitted disappears from awareness. This tactic is dangerous because it shapes belief without dialogue. There is no moment of choice. The influence happens gradually, invisibly, and internally. The person feels certain without knowing why. Resisting repetition hypnosis requires active awareness. Asking, "Why do I believe this?" and "Where did I first hear it?" helps reconnect belief to evidence. Reducing exposure, seeking opposing views, and slowing down judgment weaken the effect. Familiarity should never replace verification. Repetition hypnosis works because the brain prefers ease, consistency, and predictability. It rewards what feels known. Understanding this tactic restores the ability to pause and question. Truth does not need repetition to exist. When something is repeated endlessly, the most important question is not, "Is this true?" but "Why does it need to be repeated so much?" Illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect is a psychological phenomenon where repeated statements begin to feel true, even when they are false, misleading, or unsupported by evidence. It does not work by convincing the mind through logic. It works by familiarity. The more often the brain encounters the same claim, the easier it becomes to process, and that ease is mistakenly interpreted as truth. Over time, the mind stops asking whether the statement is accurate and starts accepting it simply because it feels known. The human brain is not designed to verify every piece of information it encounters. That would require enormous mental effort. Instead, it relies on mental shortcuts. One of the strongest shortcuts is processing fluency. When something is easy to process, the brain feels comfortable. Comfort is then confused with correctness. The illusory truth effect exploits this flaw by turning repetition into perceived validity. What makes this effect especially dangerous is that it works even when people know a statement is false at first. A person may initially reject an idea, label it as wrong, or even criticize it. But if that same idea continues to appear repeatedly in conversation, media, or social spaces, the resistance weakens. The memory of "this is false" fades faster than the feeling of "this sounds familiar." Eventually, familiarity overrides skepticism. The brain separates memory of content from memory of source. Over time, people remember hearing the statement but forget where it came from or whether it was credible. The message becomes detached from its context. When recalled later, it surfaces as something that feels true, not because it was verified, but because it was encountered often. This is why misinformation spreads so easily. The brain remembers repetition, not reliability. Another reason the illusory truth effect is so powerful is that the brain dislikes uncertainty. Familiar statements reduce mental friction. When the mind encounters a claim it has heard many times, it does not have to work hard to interpret it. That ease feels reassuring. The brain prefers that feeling to the effort of questioning. Over time, the repeated claim becomes the default explanation, even if it is inaccurate. The effect is amplified when repetition comes from multiple directions. Hearing the same statement from different people, platforms, or formats makes it feel independent and widespread. The brain interprets repetition as consensus. Even if all sources trace back to the same origin, the mind counts frequency, not originality. Volume replaces evidence. Emotion further strengthens the illusory truth effect. When repetition is paired with fear, outrage, hope, or moral language, The brain prioritizes emotional relevance over factual accuracy. Emotional repetition sticks deeper and spreads faster. This is why emotionally charged falsehoods are more persuasive than neutral truths. The illusory truth effect also explains why corrections often fail. Simply repeating a false claim in order to debunk it can unintentionally reinforce it. Even when people hear this is not true, the repeated exposure increases familiarity. Later, they may remember the claim, but forget the correction. This is one of the reasons misinformation is so difficult to undo once it spreads. This phenomenon appears everywhere. In advertising, slogans are repeated until brands feel trustworthy. In relationships, repeated labels can shape self-image. In workplaces, repeated narratives define what feels normal or acceptable. In society, repeated claims can shape collective belief even without proof. The mechanism is always the same. Familiarity becomes truth. The illusory truth effect is especially effective when people are tired, distracted, stressed, or overwhelmed. In these states, the brain relies more heavily on shortcuts. It accepts what feels easy. Critical thinking requires energy, and repetition removes the need to think deeply. Importantly, intelligence does not protect against this effect. Highly educated and analytical people experience it too. The illusion operates at a basic cognitive level. Knowing about it helps, but it does not eliminate it. Awareness only slows it down. What makes the illusory truth effect a powerful tool in dark psychology is that it removes the need for persuasion. There is no debate, no evidence, no confrontation. The influence happens quietly over time, inside the person's own mind. The belief feels self-generated, even though it was planted through exposure. Resisting this effect requires conscious effort, actively questioning familiar statements, checking sources, and noticing repetition patterns helps restore balance. Asking, "Why do I believe this?" and "Have I verified this independently?" reintroduces critical thinking. Reducing exposure to repeated unverified claims also weakens their grip. The illusory truth effect works because the human brain values familiarity, comfort, and efficiency. It mistakes ease for accuracy. Understanding this effect does not mean distrusting everything, but it does mean respecting how easily belief can be shaped. Truth does not become true through repetition, only the feeling of truth does. And learning to tell the difference is one of the most important protections against manipulation. Framing manipulation. Framing manipulation is a psychological influence tactic that works by changing how information is presented so that it shapes perception, emotion, and decision-making without changing the actual facts. The content stays the same, but the interpretation shifts. By controlling the frame, the manipulator controls what feels important, acceptable, risky, or desirable. This tactic is powerful because the human brain does not respond to facts in isolation. It responds to meaning, context, and emotional interpretation. The brain relies on frames because reality is complex. Every situation contains too much information to process fully, so the mind uses mental shortcuts to simplify it. A frame tells the brain what to focus on and what to ignore. Once a frame is accepted, everything inside it feels logical. Framing manipulation exploits this by offering a perspective that subtly favors a certain conclusion, while making alternative interpretations feel irrelevant or unreasonable. One common form of framing manipulation is gain versus loss framing. The same outcome can be presented as a benefit or a risk. Saying, "This choice gives you a 90% success rate," feels positive, while saying, "This choice has a 10% failure rate," feels negative, even though both statements describe the same reality. The brain reacts emotionally to the frame, not the math. Under loss framing, fear increases. Under gain framing, comfort increases. The decision changes without the facts changing. Another powerful framing technique involves moral framing. An action may be presented as responsible, caring, normal, or selfish, depending on how the manipulator wants it perceived. Once a moral label is attached, the brain stops evaluating the situation objectively. It shifts into identity protection mode. People want to see themselves as good, fair, and ethical. Framing something as morally correct or incorrect pressures behavior without direct force. Framing manipulation also works through language choice. Words carry emotional weight. Calling something a cut feels different from calling it an adjustment. Calling someone assertive feels different from calling them aggressive. The brain reacts to the emotional tone embedded in words. The manipulator chooses language that guides interpretation before conscious analysis begins. Another common tactic is narrowing the frame. The manipulator presents only two options, creating a false choice. The brain feels forced to pick between them, even though other options may exist. By limiting the frame, the manipulator controls the outcome. The person feels like they made a free choice, but the range of acceptable choices was already restricted. Framing manipulation is especially effective under stress, uncertainty, or emotional vulnerability. When people feel overwhelmed, they crave clarity. A strong frame provides that clarity quickly. The brain relaxes when someone else defines the situation. Unfortunately, that relief comes at the cost of independent evaluation. This tactic is often used before persuasion or pressure. The manipulator first defines what this situation is about, then introduces a solution that fits that definition. Once the frame is accepted, resistance feels irrational. The person is not arguing against a request, they are arguing against the meaning of the situation itself. Framing manipulation also explains why people can disagree so strongly about the same facts. Different frames produce different emotional realities. One person sees a decision as practical, another sees it as cruel. The disagreement is not about data, but about framing. Manipulators exploit this by choosing frames that benefit them and dismissing other frames as extreme, ignorant, or emotional. In relationships, framing manipulation may sound like "I'm doing this for your own good," or "this is just how healthy relationships work." These frames redefine control as care. Questioning the behavior feels like questioning the relationship itself. In workplaces, framing may redefine overwork as commitment or silence as professionalism. The behavior stays the same, but the meaning changes. What makes framing manipulation dangerous is that it feels reasonable. The frame often contains partial truth. That truth anchors credibility, while the distortion happens around it. The person being influenced may feel intelligent, informed, and rational, unaware that the perspective was guided. Framing manipulation also affects memory. People remember events according to the frame they were given. Over time, the frame becomes the story, and alternative interpretations fade. This can reshape how someone understands past experiences, decisions, and even their own identity. Resisting framing manipulation requires stepping outside the frame, asking what assumptions are being made, what is being emphasized or omitted, and how else could this be described, helps restore perspective. Reframing is not about rejecting everything, but about recognizing that meaning is flexible and often chosen intentionally. Framing manipulation works because humans do not experience reality directly. We experience interpretations of reality. Whoever controls the interpretation holds influence. Understanding framing does not mean becoming cynical. It means reclaiming the ability to choose how situations are understood instead of accepting the meaning handed to you. Foot in the door. Technique. The foot in the door technique is a psychological influence method that works by starting with a small, easy request and then gradually escalating to a larger one. The key idea is simple. Once a person agrees to something minor, they are more likely to agree to something bigger later. The manipulation does not rely on pressure or force. It relies on consistency. The human brain strongly prefers to see itself as consistent in beliefs and behavior, and this preference can be quietly exploited. At the beginning, the first request is intentionally harmless. It feels reasonable, polite, and difficult to refuse. The person thinks, "This doesn't cost me anything," or "saying yes doesn't matter." But that first yes is crucial. It creates a psychological shift. The person now sees themselves as someone who is cooperative, helpful, supportive, or aligned with the request. That new self-image becomes the anchor for future decisions. Once the small request is accepted, the second request appears. It is slightly bigger, but still reasonable. The brain compares it not to zero, but to the previous commitment. Because the person already said yes once, saying yes again feels natural. Saying no would create internal discomfort. The mind asks, why would I agree before but refuse now? To avoid that discomfort, the person continues complying. This happens because of the human need for internal consistency. People want their actions to match their self-image. If someone believes they are kind, helpful, or supportive, refusing a follow-up request threatens that identity. The brain resolves this threat by agreeing again. Over time, the commitments grow, not because the person wants to escalate, but because backing out feels psychologically harder than continuing. Another reason the foot in the door technique is so effective is that it lowers resistance gradually. A large request made upfront would trigger skepticism, fear, or refusal. But small steps bypass those defenses. Each step feels manageable. The brain never enters full alert mode because the change feels incremental. By the time the request becomes significant, the person is already emotionally invested. This technique also creates a sense of obligation. Even if the initial request was freely accepted, the brain begins to feel subtly responsible for continuing. The manipulator does not need to demand anything. The sense of obligation arises internally. The person may think, I've already helped, so I should keep helping, or I've already agreed, so it would be awkward to stop now. Foot in the door is often reinforced with praise or validation. After the first small agreement, the manipulator may say things like, "You're the kind of person who really cares," or "I knew I could count on you." This strengthens the identity link. The person is no longer just agreeing to actions, they are agreeing to a role. Once identity is involved, resistance weakens dramatically. This technique appears in many areas of life. In marketing, it might start with a free trial or survey, followed by a paid subscription. In relationships, it may start with small favors that turn into emotional or time-consuming obligations. In workplaces, it can begin with minor unpaid tasks that slowly become expected responsibilities. In all cases, the structure is the same: small yes, then bigger yes. What makes this tactic dangerous in dark psychology is that the person often does not realize when the shift happens. They believe each decision is independent, but psychologically, the decisions are linked. The first agreement changes the context for all future ones. The person is no longer choosing freely from a neutral position. They are choosing to stay consistent with past behavior. The foot in the door technique also exploits politeness. People dislike appearing unreliable or changing their mind. Manipulators rely on this discomfort. They frame refusal as inconsistency, disappointment, or betrayal. Even when the person feels uneasy, they continue because stopping feels worse emotionally than continuing. It is important to note that the initial request does not need to be related logically to the larger one. What matters is commitment, not relevance. Once the brain commits to an interaction or relationship, it seeks coherence. That coherence becomes the lever. This technique is not inherently evil. It can be used ethically in education, therapy, and habit building, where small positive steps lead to meaningful growth. The harm comes when it is used to bypass consent, erode boundaries, or push people into obligations they would never accept up front. Recognizing the foot in the door technique requires paying attention to escalation, asking questions like, would I agree to this if this were the first request? Or, is this still aligned with what I want? Helps break the chain. Saying no later is not hypocrisy, it is recalibration. The foot in the door technique works because humans value consistency more than freedom in the moment. It turns small choices into pathways that feel difficult to exit. Understanding it restores the ability to pause, reassess, and choose again from the present, not from past commitments that no longer serve you. Door in the face technique. The door in the face technique is a psychological influence tactic that works by making an initial request that is intentionally large, unreasonable, or likely to be refused, followed by a smaller request that seems much more acceptable by comparison. The power of this technique does not come from the second request alone, but from contrast and social pressure. By first asking for too much, the manipulator reshapes what feels reasonable, making the follow-up request feel like a compromise rather than a demand. At the core of this technique is the human tendency to compare options instead of evaluating them independently. When the brain hears a very large request, it immediately reacts with resistance. The request feels extreme, intrusive, or unfair. But once that request is rejected, the mental frame shifts. The second, smaller request is no longer judged on its own merits. It is judged relative to the first one. Compared to something excessive, almost anything feels reasonable. Another powerful mechanism involved is reciprocity. Humans are wired to return favors and concessions. When the manipulator appears to back down from the first request, the brain interprets this as a social concession. Even though the first request was never genuine, the second request feels like a compromise. The person feels subtle pressure to reciprocate by agreeing. Refusing again would feel rude, uncooperative, or unfair. This technique also exploits guilt. After refusing the first request, many people feel mild discomfort. Saying no creates tension, especially for people who value harmony or politeness. When the second request arrives, agreeing becomes a way to relieve that discomfort. The person is no longer deciding purely based on desire or boundaries, but based on emotional relief. The door in the face technique works particularly well because it creates the illusion of choice and fairness. The manipulator frames the interaction as a negotiation, even when it is not. The person feels like they are meeting in the middle, when in reality the manipulator controlled the range of options from the start. The middle was predetermined. This tactic is often used in sales, fundraising, negotiations, and interpersonal relationships. In sales, a high-priced option is introduced first, followed by a lower-priced one that suddenly feels like a bargain. In fundraising, a large donation is requested first, followed by a smaller one that feels easy to accept. In relationships, someone may make an extreme demand, then retreat to something they wanted all along. What makes this technique especially effective is timing. The second request comes quickly after the first rejection. This prevents the brain from resetting. The emotional response to the first request is still active. The contrast is fresh. The pressure to resolve the interaction is high. The person has not had time to reflect or regain emotional balance. Another reason this tactic works is that it reframes compliance as kindness. Agreeing to the second request feels generous, flexible, and cooperative. The person wants to see themselves as reasonable. The manipulator leverages that self-image. Saying yes reinforces the identity of being fair and agreeable, even if the agreement goes against personal interest. The door in the face technique also lowers suspicion. The manipulator does not appear pushy. In fact, they appear accommodating. By stepping back, they seem respectful. This reduces defensive reactions. The person believes they were not pressured, even though the psychological pressure was built into the structure of the interaction. Importantly, the first request does not need to be realistic or sincere. It only needs to be large enough to be rejected. The rejection itself is part of the strategy. Once the refusal happens, the manipulator gains leverage. The second request feels smaller, not because it is small, but because the reference point was artificially inflated. This technique can be harmful because it bypasses genuine consent. The person agrees, not because the second request aligns with their needs or values, but because the psychological environment was manipulated. Over time, repeated exposure to this tactic can weaken boundaries and train people to accept compromises they would normally reject. It is important to distinguish this manipulation from healthy negotiation. In healthy negotiation, both parties openly adjust expectations. In the door in the face technique, the adjustment is one-sided and strategic. The initial request was never meant to be accepted. It was a tool. Resisting this tactic requires recognizing contrast. Asking, "Would I agree to this if the first request had never been made?" helps restore clarity. Slowing the interaction also weakens the effect. Time allows emotional reactions to settle and independent judgment to return. The door in the face technique works because humans are social, comparison-driven, and sensitive to perceived fairness. It exploits politeness, guilt, and contrast to guide decisions quietly. Understanding it allows you to separate real compromise from manufactured pressure. When you judge requests on their own merit instead of relative framing, the door closes to manipulation. Reverse psychology. Reverse psychology is a psychological influence tactic that works by encouraging someone to do the opposite of what is openly suggested. Instead of directly asking for a behavior, the manipulator presents resistance, discouragement, or an opposing stance, knowing that the person will feel compelled to assert their independence by doing exactly what was discouraged. This technique does not work on logic. It works on identity, autonomy, and the human need to feel in control of one's own choices. At its core, reverse psychology exploits reactance. Reactance is a psychological response that occurs when people feel their freedom of choice is being threatened. When someone senses pressure, control, or limitation, the brain pushes back. It wants to restore autonomy. Reverse psychology creates the illusion of restriction or doubt, triggering this pushback instinct. The person believes they are acting freely, when in reality their reaction was anticipated and guided. The reason this technique is effective is that humans strongly dislike being told what to do, especially when they value independence, pride, or self-direction. When a suggestion feels like an order, resistance appears. Reverse psychology sidesteps that resistance by removing the order and replacing it with doubt. Statements like, "You probably wouldn't want to do this," or "This might be too difficult for you," subtly challenge identity. The brain responds by wanting to prove the opposite. Reverse psychology also works by shifting motivation from external to internal. Instead of complying to please someone else, the person acts to defend their self-image. The action feels self-driven. That feeling of ownership makes the behavior stronger and more emotionally charged. The person is no longer responding to a request, they are responding to a challenge. Another reason reverse psychology works is because it frames resistance as expected. When someone is told they probably won't do something, refusal feels predictable and passive. Doing the opposite feels active and empowering. The brain prefers to feel active rather than controlled. This illusion of empowerment is central to the tactic's success. This technique is especially effective on people who are stubborn, independent, competitive, or sensitive to authority. These individuals are more likely to react against perceived limitation. Children, teenagers, and adults with strong autonomy needs are particularly susceptible because their identity is closely tied to self-direction and control. Reverse psychology often appears playful or indirect, which lowers suspicion. The manipulator does not appear demanding or aggressive. They appear detached, doubtful, or even uninterested. This disarms defenses. The person believes they are choosing freely, unaware that the path was anticipated. In relationships, reverse psychology may appear as emotional withdrawal or lowered expectations. Someone might say, "Do whatever you want," or "I don't care anymore," knowing that the other person will feel compelled to re-engage or prove commitment. In these cases, the tactic relies on emotional insecurity and the desire to restore balance or reassurance. In persuasion contexts, reverse psychology may involve discouraging a choice to make it seem more appealing. By presenting something as optional, risky, or not for everyone, the manipulator increases its desirability. The brain associates restriction with value. What feels forbidden or discouraged often feels more attractive. This tactic also leverages ego. When someone's competence or capability is subtly questioned, the brain reacts defensively. The person wants to demonstrate ability, intelligence, or strength. Reverse psychology nudges behavior by triggering that defensive motivation. What makes reverse psychology dangerous in dark psychology is that it removes conscious consent. The person does not realize they are being influenced. They believe they chose independently. This makes the behavior harder to question or reverse later. The decision feels authentic, even though the conditions were engineered. Reverse psychology can also be combined with other tactics, such as scarcity, time pressure, or guilt. For example, discouraging someone by saying they may not be ready while implying others are intensifies the pressure. The brain reacts not just to restriction, but to comparison and fear of missing out. It is important to note that reverse psychology does not work on everyone, and it does not work consistently. It depends heavily on personality, context, and emotional state. People who are highly reflective or emotionally secure are less reactive to perceived challenges, but when it works quietly and effectively. The ethical line is crossed when reverse psychology is used to push people into decisions that do not serve their interests, violate boundaries, or exploit emotional vulnerabilities. Using someone's need for autonomy against them turns independence into a weakness. Resisting reverse psychology requires slowing down emotional reactions. When you feel a sudden urge to prove something, assert independence, or do the opposite of what was suggested, that feeling itself is a signal. Asking, why do I want to do this right now, and is this choice aligned with what I actually want, restores agency. Reverse psychology works because humans value freedom more than comfort and identity more than compliance. It turns resistance into a tool. Understanding it allows you to pause, reflect, and choose intentionally rather than reactively. True autonomy is not about doing the opposite of what is suggested. It is about choosing based on awareness, not impulse. Triangulation. Triangulation is a psychological manipulation tactic that involves bringing a third person, real or implied, into a situation to control emotions, shift power, or create insecurity. Instead of addressing issues directly, the manipulator uses comparison, indirect communication, or outside references to destabilize the target. The goal is not resolution. The goal is control through confusion, competition, and self-doubt. At its core, triangulation works by disrupting direct connection. Healthy communication happens between two people who speak openly and clearly. Triangulation breaks that line and inserts a third point. This third point may be another person, a group, an authority, an ex, a coworker, everyone else, or even an abstract standard. Once the triangle is formed, the manipulator controls the flow of information and emotion. The human brain is extremely sensitive to social comparison. From an evolutionary perspective, status within a group mattered for survival. Being replaced, excluded, or ranked lower triggered fear. Triangulation exploits this instinct. When someone hears, "Others agree with me," "They don't have this problem," or "Someone else understands me better," the brain immediately shifts into comparison mode. Logic weakens, emotion takes over. One of the most common forms of triangulation is comparison. The manipulator compares the target to someone else in a way that lowers confidence or creates competition. This might sound like, "My friend wouldn't react this way," or "My ex never had an issue with this," or "Other people handle this better than you." The target stops focusing on the actual issue and starts focusing on self-worth. That distraction is the point. Another form involves indirect communication. Instead of addressing concerns directly, the manipulator claims that a third party is involved. Statements like, "People are saying," or "everyone thinks," introduce pressure without accountability. The manipulator does not need to prove anything. The imagined group becomes the authority. The target feels outnumbered, even when the group may not exist. Triangulation also creates rivalry. When a third person is implied as a better option, the target may feel the need to compete for approval, affection, or validation. This is especially damaging in relationships. The manipulator benefits from being positioned as the prize, while the target works harder to regain favor. The power imbalance grows silently. This tactic is particularly effective because it creates uncertainty. The target does not know what is real, who said what, or where they stand. The brain hates uncertainty. To reduce it, the person may comply, apologize, overextend, or suppress their needs. The manipulator regains control without ever making a direct demand. Triangulation is also used to avoid accountability. By referencing a third party, the manipulator deflects responsibility. If challenged, they can claim they are just repeating what others said. This protects them from confrontation while still delivering the emotional impact. The harm is real, but the source feels slippery. In families, triangulation may involve one member being compared to another, creating favoritism or rivalry. In workplaces, it may involve management referencing unnamed complaints or comparing employees unfairly. In friendships, it may involve gossip used strategically to isolate or influence. In romantic relationships, it may involve ex-partners, potential alternatives, or emotional alliances used to provoke insecurity. One of the most damaging effects of triangulation is erosion of trust. The target no longer knows where they stand. They may start doubting their value, overanalyzing interactions, or constantly adjusting behavior to avoid comparison. The relationship becomes emotionally unstable, not because of conflict, but because of manipulation. Triangulation also silences direct communication. When a third party is always present in the conversation, even implicitly, honest dialogue feels risky. The target may fear being judged, compared, or reported. This keeps them emotionally guarded while the manipulator stays in control. It is important to distinguish triangulation from healthy perspective sharing. Healthy communication involves transparency and consent. Triangulation involves secrecy, implication, and pressure. The difference lies in intent and effect. If a third party is used to intimidate, compare, or destabilize, manipulation is present. Breaking the power of triangulation requires refusing to engage with indirect dynamics. Asking clear questions like, "Who exactly said that?" or "Why are we involving someone else instead of talking directly?" brings the interaction back to reality. Manipulation loses power when the triangle collapses back into a straight line. Triangulation works because humans fear exclusion, comparison, and loss of status. It turns social instinct into a weapon. Understanding it restores clarity and self-trust. Direct communication builds connection. Indirect comparison destroys it. When you recognize triangulation, you regain the ability to step out of the triangle and back into your own grounded perspective. The contrast principle. The contrast principle is a psychological manipulation effect that changes how we perceive something by placing it next to something very different. Instead of judging an option on its own value, the brain judges it relative to what came just before. This comparison happens automatically and unconsciously. The object, request, or idea itself does not change, but because the reference point changes, our perception changes. This is what makes the contrast principle so powerful and so frequently used in dark psychology. The human brain is not good at absolute judgment. It is far better at relative judgment. Throughout evolution, humans learn to compare rather than measure. Is this threat bigger or smaller than the last one? Is this resource more or less than before? This comparison-based thinking helped survival, but it also created a vulnerability. When someone controls the comparison, they control perception. The contrast principle works because the brain needs a baseline. When the first thing we encounter sets that baseline, everything that follows is judged against it. If the first thing is extreme, the second thing feels moderate, even if it is objectively large. If the first thing is unpleasant, the second thing feels pleasant by comparison. The brain does not reset between experiences. It carries the previous context forward. In manipulation, this principle is often used by presenting an exaggerated option first. That option is not meant to be accepted. Its purpose is to stretch perception. When the real target option is introduced afterward, it feels smaller, safer, or more reasonable. The person does not ask, "Is this good for me?" They ask, "Is this better than the first thing?" That shift in question is where control happens. The contrast principle is also deeply emotional. It changes how something feels, not just how it looks. A demand feels lighter after a more extreme demand. A criticism feels softer after a harsh insult. A price feels cheaper after an absurdly high one. Even emotions are judged by contrast. Relief feels stronger after fear. Gratitude feels stronger after deprivation. Manipulators use this emotional swing to guide reactions. Another reason the contrast principle is so effective is that it happens quickly. The brain does not pause to recalibrate. It reacts instantly. By the time logic could intervene, the emotional judgment has already been made. People often justify the decision afterward, believing it was rational, unaware that the comparison shaped the outcome. This tactic appears in many areas of life. In sales, a very expensive item is shown first to make other items feel affordable. In negotiations, extreme demands are made to make compromises feel generous. In relationships, harsh behavior may be followed by slightly better behavior that feels like improvement, even if it is still unhealthy. In workplaces, overwhelming workloads may be introduced so that slightly less overwhelming ones feel acceptable. The contrast principle also works with time, effort, and responsibility. After someone is asked to do something very demanding, a second request that is still unreasonable may feel easy. The brain compares effort, not fairness. This is why people sometimes agree to things they would have rejected outright if presented alone. One dangerous aspect of the contrast principle is that it can normalize harm. When negative behavior is gradually contrasted against worse behavior, the lesser harm begins to feel acceptable. Over time, standards shift. What once felt wrong starts to feel normal simply because something worse was introduced first. This is how boundaries erode without obvious conflict. The contrast principle also interacts with memory. People remember how they felt in comparison, not the absolute experience. If something feels like an improvement, it is remembered positively, even if it was still harmful or unfair. This distorts judgment over time and makes manipulation harder to recognize. It is important to understand that the contrast principle does not require deception. The manipulator does not need to lie, they only need to control sequence. Order matters more than content. The first impression reshapes the second, and the second feels reasonable because the scale has been altered. This effect is not limited to external manipulation. People can experience it internally as well. Comparing current circumstances to worse past experiences can make unhealthy situations feel tolerable. While this can be adaptive in some cases, it can also trap people in conditions that are objectively harmful. Resisting the contrast principle requires isolating the option being presented, asking, how would this feel if it were the only option, or would I accept this without the comparison? Helps reset perception. Taking time between exposures also weakens the effect because it allows the brain to establish a new baseline. The contrast principle works because humans are comparison-driven creatures. We do not evaluate reality in isolation. We evaluate it relative to context. When someone controls that context, they control perception. Understanding this principle restores the ability to judge things on their own merit instead of through manipulated comparisons. When contrast is removed, clarity returns. Intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a psychological influence mechanism where rewards, affection, approval, or positive outcomes are given inconsistently and unpredictably. Instead of receiving a response every time, the person receives it only sometimes. This uncertainty is what gives the tactic its power. The human brain becomes more focused, more emotionally invested, and more persistent when rewards are irregular rather than consistent. What feels confusing on the surface is psychologically one of the strongest conditioning patterns that exists. The human brain is wired to learn through patterns. When a reward follows an action consistently, the brain understands the relationship quickly and then relaxes. But when the reward appears randomly, the brain becomes hyper-alert. It pays closer attention, trying to figure out what caused the reward. This heightened focus strengthens emotional attachment and behavioral persistence. The brain keeps engaging because it believes the reward could happen again at any moment. This mechanism evolved from survival behavior. In nature, food and safety were not guaranteed every time an effort was made. When success came unpredictably, persistence increased survival chances. That same wiring still exists today. When the brain encounters unpredictable rewards, it treats them as more valuable. The uncertainty makes the reward feel more meaningful, even if it is small. Intermittent reinforcement works by creating anticipation. The brain releases dopamine not only when a reward appears, but also when it might appear. That maybe becomes addictive. The person keeps engaging, hoping that the next interaction will bring relief, approval, or pleasure. This is why behaviors reinforced intermittently are harder to stop than those reinforced consistently. In manipulation contexts, intermittent reinforcement often appears as inconsistent affection, attention, praise, or responsiveness. A person may be warm one moment and distant the next. Approval may be given after periods of neglect. The recipient becomes emotionally invested in regaining the positive state. The brain associates effort with hope, not with guaranteed results. One reason intermittent reinforcement is so powerful is that it distorts perception. The person remembers the highs more vividly than the lows. The rare positive moments stand out, while the consistent negative or neutral experiences fade into the background. The brain says, "It's worth it," because sometimes it's really good. This keeps the person attached even when the overall pattern is unhealthy. This mechanism also creates self-blame. When rewards are inconsistent, the person assumes the problem must be their behavior. They think, "If I just do the right thing, I'll get the reward again." This shifts responsibility inward and strengthens dependence. The manipulator does not need to explain their behavior. The uncertainty does the work. Intermittent reinforcement is especially effective in emotional relationships, workplaces, and social validation systems. In relationships, it may look like affection given unpredictably after periods of withdrawal. In workplaces, it may look like praise or recognition given inconsistently, keeping people overworking in hope of approval. In digital environments, likes, notifications, and attention appear randomly, creating compulsive checking behavior. Another reason this tactic is so difficult to break is that it resists extinction. When consistent rewards stop, behavior stops quickly. When intermittent rewards stop, the brain increases effort. This is called the extinction burst. The person tries harder, not less. This is why people stay in unhealthy dynamics far longer than outsiders expect. Intermittent reinforcement also disrupts emotional regulation. The constant switching between hope and disappointment creates anxiety and emotional dependency. The nervous system stays activated, waiting for the next reward. Calm is replaced by vigilance. The person becomes more focused on the manipulator's behavior than on their own needs. This tactic does not require cruelty. It can be subtle and passive. Simply being unpredictable is enough. The lack of clarity creates emotional investment. The brain fills the gaps with hope. Importantly, intermittent reinforcement can happen unintentionally. Not all inconsistent behavior is manipulation. The difference lies in awareness and outcome. When unpredictability is used to control, maintain power, or extract effort without accountability, it becomes harmful. The danger of intermittent reinforcement is that it creates attachment without security. The person feels bonded but never safe. They chase moments of relief instead of stability. Over time, this erodes self-worth and emotional independence. Breaking free from intermittent reinforcement requires recognizing the pattern, not the moments. Looking at overall consistency instead of rare highs restores perspective. Asking, is this relationship or system stable, or am I surviving on occasional rewards? Helps shift focus back to reality. Intermittent reinforcement works because the brain is built to chase possibility. It confuses unpredictability with value. Understanding this mechanism allows you to stop chasing what appears occasionally and start valuing what is consistent. Stability, not surprise, is what actually supports well-being. The fear-then relief trick. The fear-then relief trick is a psychological manipulation tactic that works by first triggering fear, stress, or anxiety, and then suddenly removing it. This emotional swing creates a moment of vulnerability where the brain becomes unusually open to suggestion, compliance, or influence. The power of this technique does not come from fear alone, but from the sharp contrast between fear and relief. When relief arrives, the mind relaxes so quickly that critical thinking temporarily drops. To understand why this works, it helps to look at how the nervous system functions. When fear appears, the brain enters a threat response. Stress hormones increase, attention narrows, and the body prepares for danger. In this state, the brain is focused on survival, not reasoning. When the threat suddenly disappears, the nervous system shifts rapidly from high alert to calm. This sudden release feels intensely relieving. The brain experiences a wave of emotional safety, gratitude, and openness. That moment of relief is the key. When fear is lifted, the brain is still recovering. Cognitive defenses are lowered. The person feels safe again and wants to maintain that safety. This creates a powerful psychological window where suggestions, requests, or agreements feel easier and more acceptable. The brain associates compliance with continued relief. The fear then relief trick works because humans are not good at recalibrating instantly. The nervous system does not reset immediately after stress. Even though the danger is gone, the emotional system remains influenced by what just happened. In that vulnerable state, people are more likely to say yes, agree, comply, or trust. This tactic often begins with confusion, urgency, or threat. It might involve sudden accusations, warnings, authority pressure, or implied consequences. The fear does not have to be extreme. Mild anxiety is enough. What matters is that the person feels unsettled. Then, just as quickly, the manipulator removes the threat. They clarify, soften their tone, or offer reassurance. Relief floods in. Once relief is felt, the brain wants to keep it. The person becomes more cooperative to avoid returning to fear. Even unrelated requests feel acceptable because the emotional system is focused on staying calm. The manipulator may ask for agreement, information, forgiveness, or compliance immediately after relieving the fear. The timing is deliberate. One reason this technique is so effective is that it creates emotional contrast. Relief feels stronger after fear than it would on its own. The brain interprets the manipulator as the source of safety. This creates trust, gratitude, or even bonding, even if the same person caused the fear in the first place. The emotional memory links them to relief rather than threat. The fear then relief trick is often used by authority figures, salespeople, interrogators, and manipulators in relationships. In authority contexts, someone may threaten consequences, then suddenly dismiss them, followed by a request. In sales, urgency or risk is introduced, then removed by presenting a solution. In relationships, emotional withdrawal or conflict may be followed by warmth, making the warmth feel disproportionately valuable. This tactic also explains why people sometimes agree to things they later regret. At the moment of relief, their decision-making was impaired. They were not choosing calmly. They were choosing to maintain emotional safety. Once the nervous system returns to normal, the decision no longer feels aligned, but it has already been made. Another reason the fear then relief trick works is because it disrupts memory clarity. Strong emotional shifts blur judgment. People remember the relief more vividly than the fear. The discomfort fades faster than the sense of safety. This makes the interaction feel positive in hindsight, even if it was manipulative. This technique is especially effective on people who dislike conflict, fear authority, or are emotionally sensitive. Their nervous systems react strongly to stress, making the relief phase even more powerful. It is also effective when people are tired, distracted, or under pressure, because recovery from stress takes longer in those states. It is important to note that fear then relief can happen accidentally. Not every emotional swing is manipulation. The key difference is intent and pattern. When fear is deliberately created or exaggerated, and relief is used to extract compliance, manipulation is present. The danger of this tactic is that it bypasses informed consent. The person is not agreeing from a stable emotional state, they are reacting. Over time, repeated exposure to fear then relief can create dependency, where the person tolerates fear because they crave the relief that follows. Resisting this tactic requires recognizing emotional timing. If a request or suggestion comes immediately after stress, pause. The urge to agree may not come from logic, but from relief. Taking time allows the nervous system to stabilize and judgment to return. The fear then relief trick works because humans are emotionally reactive creatures. We crave safety more than clarity in moments of stress. Understanding this tactic restores the ability to wait, breathe, and choose from calm rather than relief. True decisions should be made when fear is gone and relief is settled, not when emotions are still swinging. False flattery. False flattery is a psychological manipulation tactic that uses exaggerated, insincere, or strategically timed praise to lower a person's defenses and gain influence over their thoughts or behavior. Unlike genuine appreciation, false flattery is not about recognizing real qualities or effort. It is about creating emotional leverage. The praise is a tool, not a gift. Its purpose is to make the person more agreeable, trusting, or compliant. Humans are naturally responsive to positive feedback. Compliments activate reward centers in the brain, releasing dopamine and creating a sense of pleasure and validation. This reaction happens quickly and automatically. Even when people consciously suspect that praise might be exaggerated, the emotional response still occurs. False flattery exploits this gap between emotional reaction and rational evaluation. One reason false flattery works so well is that it targets identity. Compliments often focus on traits people value or wish to believe about themselves, such as intelligence, kindness, uniqueness, or competence. When someone praises these traits, the brain experiences confirmation. It feels seen and affirmed. This makes the person more open to influence from the source of that validation. False flattery also creates subtle obligation. When someone compliments you, especially in a warm or confident way, social norms push you toward reciprocation. You may feel pressure to be polite, cooperative, or accommodating in return. The manipulator benefits from this social reflex. You are not agreeing because you want to, but because refusing feels uncomfortable. Another powerful element of false flattery is timing. The praise often appears right before or after a request. Before a request, it softens resistance. After a request, it reinforces compliance. The brain links agreement with positive feedback, strengthening the behavior. Over time, the person may begin associating approval with compliance, even unconsciously. False flattery often sounds specific but is actually empty. Statements like, "You're one of the few people who really gets this," or "You're not like most people," are designed to feel personal while remaining vague. This vagueness allows the compliment to adapt to the listener's self-image. The person fills in the meaning themselves, which makes the praise feel more authentic. This tactic is especially effective on people who are empathetic, approval-seeking, insecure, or underappreciated. When someone has not received enough genuine recognition, false flattery feels even more powerful. The brain becomes eager to maintain the source of validation. The manipulator gains emotional leverage without offering real support or respect. False flattery is often paired with subtle comparison. Praising someone by implying they are better than others creates separation and dependency. Statements like, "Most people wouldn't understand this, but you do," isolate the person emotionally. They feel special, chosen, and aligned with the manipulator. Disagreeing later would threaten that special status. In workplaces, false flattery may be used to extract extra effort without proper compensation. Praise replaces boundaries. In relationships, it may be used to bypass consent or silence concerns. In sales, it may be used to create artificial trust. In all cases, the praise is conditional. It exists to move behavior, not to honor truth. What makes false flattery dangerous is that it feels positive. People are less likely to question praise than criticism. The manipulation hides inside kindness. Over time, the person may ignore red flags because they associate the manipulator with good feelings. The emotional reward overshadows logical evaluation. Another reason false flattery works is that people want to stay consistent with positive labels. If someone is praised as generous, smart, or open-minded, refusing a request may feel like betraying that image. The brain avoids this discomfort by complying. The manipulator has turned identity into a lever. False flattery can also distort self-perception. When praise is repeated, even if it is insincere, the brain begins to internalize it. This can inflate ego in some cases, or create dependence in others. Either way, self-image becomes tied to external approval rather than internal truth. It is important to distinguish false flattery from genuine appreciation. Genuine praise is specific, balanced, and not tied to immediate gain. False flattery often appears excessive, poorly timed, or followed by pressure. The key difference is intent. Is the praise meant to honor or to extract? Resisting false flattery does not require rejecting compliments. It requires pausing. Asking, "What comes next?" or "Would this praise still exist if I said no?" helps reveal intent. True respect does not disappear when boundaries appear. False flattery works because humans crave recognition and belonging. It turns validation into currency. Understanding this tactic allows you to enjoy genuine praise without being steered by artificial approval. When self-worth is grounded internally, flattery loses its power. Praise becomes information, not control. Overloading with information. Overloading with information is a psychological manipulation tactic that works by overwhelming a person with too much data, detail, explanation, or complexity, making it difficult for them to think clearly, question what is being said, or make a confident decision. Instead of hiding information, the manipulator floods the situation with it. The result is not clarity, but confusion. When the brain is overloaded, it becomes passive, compliant, and more likely to defer to whoever appears confident or authoritative. The human brain has limits. It can only process a certain amount of information at one time. When that limit is exceeded, cognitive fatigue sets in. Attention weakens, working memory overloads, and critical thinking slows down. In this state, the brain looks for relief. The easiest relief is to stop analyzing and simply accept what is being presented. Overloading with information exploits this exact moment. This tactic works because confusion feels uncomfortable. Humans naturally seek simplicity and resolution. When faced with too many details, explanations, numbers, exceptions, or technical terms, the brain feels lost. It struggles to identify what matters most. Instead of pushing through, it often gives up. The manipulator then steps in as the guide, offering a conclusion or solution that feels like a way out of the mental fog. One common form of information overload is excessive explanation. The manipulator talks continuously, uses long sentences, complex logic, and layered justifications. The listener may initially try to follow, but soon loses track. By the time the explanation ends, the listener no longer remembers the original question or concern. They may feel embarrassed to ask for clarification, so they nod along and agree. Another form involves technical language or jargon. By using terms that sound advanced or specialized, the manipulator creates an imbalance of knowledge. The listener feels inferior or uninformed. This triggers self-doubt. Instead of questioning the content, the person questions themselves. The thought becomes, they must know what they're talking about. Authority replaces understanding. Overloading with information also works by exhausting resistance. When someone raises a concern and is met with a flood of explanations, counterpoints, and details, they may feel emotionally drained. The effort required to challenge each point feels overwhelming. Giving up feels easier than continuing. The manipulator does not need to win the argument. They only need to outlast the listener's energy. This tactic is especially effective in situations involving power imbalance, such as workplaces, legal settings, sales, or authority relationships. The person with perceived expertise controls the pace and volume of information. The other person feels pressured to keep up. The faster and denser the information comes, the harder it becomes to slow the interaction down. Overloading with information can also be used defensively. When someone is confronted or questioned, the manipulator may respond with excessive detail to deflect attention. The original issue gets buried under explanations. The listener becomes confused about what they were even concerned about. Accountability dissolves into complexity. Emotion plays an important role here as well. When the brain is overloaded, emotional regulation weakens. People may feel anxious, inadequate, or mentally tired. In that state, they are more likely to accept conclusions they would normally challenge. Agreement becomes a way to restore emotional balance and end the discomfort. Another reason this tactic works is social pressure. People do not want to appear unintelligent. When overwhelmed, they may pretend to understand rather than ask questions. The manipulator benefits from this silence. Confusion is mistaken for agreement. Over time, repeated exposure to information overload can train people to stop questioning altogether. They learn that raising concerns leads to mental exhaustion. This creates passive compliance. The manipulator no longer needs to overwhelm actively. The expectation of overload does the work. It is important to distinguish information overload from genuine complexity. Some topics are truly complex and require detailed explanation. The difference lies in intent and outcome. Healthy explanation increases understanding and invites questions. Manipulative overload decreases understanding and shuts questions down. The danger of overloading with information is that it creates the illusion of transparency. It looks like honesty because so much is being shared. But clarity is not about quantity. It is about relevance and comprehension. Too much information can hide the truth just as effectively as too little. Resisting this tactic requires slowing the interaction down. Asking for summaries, clarifications, or written explanations shifts control. Saying, "Let's focus on one point at a time," helps reduce overload. Taking breaks or revisiting the issue later also restores cognitive capacity. Overloading with information works because the brain seeks relief from confusion. It turns mental fatigue into compliance. Understanding this tactic restores the right to pause, ask, and simplify. Clarity is not a weakness, it is a boundary. When information truly serves understanding, it empowers. When it overwhelms, it controls. The mirror effect. The mirror effect is a psychological influence tactic that works by subtly reflecting another person's behavior, language, emotions, attitudes, or beliefs back to them in order to create trust, comfort, and unconscious alignment. When done skillfully, it makes the other person feel understood, validated, and emotionally safe, often without realizing why. The manipulation does not come from what is said, but from how closely the interaction feels familiar and synchronized. Humans are deeply social beings. From infancy, we learn connection through imitation. Babies mirror facial expressions. Children copy tone and posture. This mirroring builds bonding and safety. The brain associates similarity with trust because, historically, people who were similar were more likely to belong to the same group and pose less threat. The mirror effect exploits this instinct by creating artificial similarity. When someone mirrors you, your nervous system relaxes. Your brain interprets the interaction as smooth and non-threatening. You feel seen. You feel like the other person gets you. This feeling happens quickly and below conscious awareness. You may simply think, "I like this person," without being able to explain why. That emotional comfort lowers defenses and increases openness to influence. Mirroring can happen in many subtle ways. It may involve copying posture, gestures, facial expressions, or speaking pace. It can also involve mirroring emotional tone, values, opinions, or even complaints. If you express frustration and the other person mirrors that frustration, it feels validating. If you share a belief and the other person echoes it back, it feels affirming. The brain responds to this alignment by increasing trust. One reason the mirror effect is so powerful is that it creates the illusion of shared identity. The brain starts grouping the other person with "people like me." Once someone is categorized as similar, their opinions carry more weight. Disagreement feels less likely. Influence becomes easier, not because of persuasion, but because of perceived sameness. In dark psychology, mirroring is used strategically, not authentically. The manipulator does not necessarily share the same values or feelings. They reflect them temporarily to gain rapport. Once trust is established, they may guide the interaction toward their own goals. Because the bond feels natural, the influence feels earned rather than forced. The mirror effect is often used early in interactions. First impressions matter. If someone mirrors you quickly, rapport forms quickly. The brain assumes connection is mutual, even if it is one-sided. This is why mirroring is common in sales, negotiations, interviews, and persuasion contexts. Trust accelerates compliance. Another reason the mirror effect works is that it reduces social friction. Conversations feel easier, silences feel comfortable, the person feels less need to guard themselves. In this relaxed state, critical thinking decreases. The brain prioritizes harmony over analysis. Suggestions slip in more easily. Mirroring also reinforces self-image. When someone reflects your views back to you, it strengthens your sense of being right, understood, or justified. This can deepen commitment to a belief or course of action. The manipulator does not need to argue. They simply agree and amplify. The person convinces themselves. The mirror effect can also be emotional. Mirroring sadness, excitement, or concern creates emotional resonance. This resonance builds attachment. The person feels emotionally accompanied. In that state, influence becomes relational rather than logical. Requests feel personal, not transactional. What makes the mirror effect especially effective is that it feels respectful. Unlike pressure or force, mirroring feels gentle. It does not trigger resistance. In fact, it often feels supportive. That is why it is difficult to detect. People rarely question someone who feels aligned with them. However, there is a difference between natural mirroring and manipulative mirroring. Natural mirroring happens unconsciously and reciprocally. Manipulative mirroring is deliberate, asymmetric, and goal-oriented. The danger appears when mirroring is used to bypass boundaries, extract compliance, or create false intimacy. In relationships, manipulative mirroring may involve temporarily adopting interests, values, or emotional stances to build attachment, only to withdraw them later. This can create confusion and dependency. In professional settings, mirroring may be used to gain trust before introducing pressure or demands. The mirror effect also interacts with power dynamics. When someone in authority mirrors you, the validation feels even stronger. When someone mirrors insecurity or doubt, they may later guide you toward dependence. The technique itself is neutral. Its impact depends on intent. Resisting manipulative mirroring does not require suspicion of all rapport. It requires awareness. When connection feels unusually fast or intense, it is worth pausing. Asking, do they actually share these views or are they reflecting me, helps restore balance. True connection remains consistent even when disagreement appears. The mirror effect works because humans trust similarity more than evidence. It turns familiarity into influence. Understanding this tactic allows you to enjoy genuine connection while remaining grounded in your own judgment. When alignment is real, it survives honesty. When it is artificial, it fades when questioned. Awareness keeps the mirror from becoming a mask. Pacing and leading. Pacing and leading is a psychological influence technique that works by first aligning with a person's current thoughts, emotions, or experiences, and then gradually guiding them toward a new perspective, decision, or behavior. The power of this tactic lies in sequence. Influence does not begin with change, it begins with agreement. By matching what feels true to the other person, resistance drops. Once trust and alignment are established, direction becomes possible. At its core, pacing means meeting someone where they are. This can involve acknowledging their feelings, mirroring their language, agreeing with obvious facts, or validating their current state. Statements like, "You're feeling overwhelmed, this situation is frustrating," or "Anyone in your position would feel this way," are examples of pacing. The brain responds positively to this alignment. It feels understood. That feeling creates safety. Humans resist influence when they feel misunderstood or challenged too quickly. The brain interprets disagreement as threat. Pacing removes that threat. By confirming what the person already believes or feels, the manipulator signals, "I'm on your side." This reduces emotional defenses and builds rapport. The person relaxes because there is no immediate conflict to resolve. Once pacing is established, leading begins. Leading involves introducing a subtle shift. It may be a suggestion, a reframing, or a small directional change. Because the person already feels aligned, they are more likely to follow. The brain assumes continuity. It thinks, "They understood me before, so this next step must also make sense." The influence feels natural, not imposed. This technique works because humans are pattern-oriented. When someone consistently matches our experience, we assume they are trustworthy. Trust makes guidance acceptable. The manipulator does not force change. They let the person move themselves, guided by gentle cues. The sense of autonomy remains intact, even though the direction is being shaped. Pacing and leading is often used in communication, therapy, negotiation, and persuasion. In ethical contexts, it helps people feel heard before being helped. In dark psychology, it is used to guide people toward outcomes that benefit the influencer, not necessarily the person being influenced. The method looks the same. The intent is what changes. One reason this technique is so effective is that pacing feels like empathy. The person feels emotionally validated. That validation is powerful. It can create attachment and openness quickly. When someone feels emotionally accompanied, they are more willing to listen and less likely to question direction. Another reason pacing and leading works is that it avoids direct confrontation. Instead of challenging beliefs head-on, which creates resistance, the manipulator acknowledges them first. Once acknowledged, those beliefs soften. The brain no longer feels the need to defend them as strongly. This creates room for change. The leading phase often begins very subtly. It may involve a small suggestion that feels logical given the pacing. For example, after acknowledging stress, the manipulator may suggest a solution that seems to offer relief. The brain, already seeking comfort, accepts the suggestion easily. The shift feels self-directed. Over time, repeated pacing and leading can move someone far from their original position. Each step feels reasonable because it follows the last one. The person does not notice the gradual change because there was never a sharp break. Influence happens through continuity, not force. This tactic is especially effective on people who value harmony, empathy, and understanding. They respond strongly to feeling seen. Once trust is established, they may follow guidance even when it subtly conflicts with their long-term interests. The desire to maintain connection overrides deeper evaluation. Pacing and leading also interacts with authority. When someone perceived as knowledgeable or calm paces your experience, the validation feels even stronger. Their lead feels safer. The brain assumes competence. This can make people accept guidance without fully examining it. What makes pacing and leading dangerous in manipulation is that it hides influence inside agreement. The person rarely feels manipulated. They feel guided. Because resistance never appears, consent feels implicit, even when choices are being shaped intentionally. It is important to distinguish this from healthy communication. Healthy pacing respects autonomy and invites consent for change. Manipulative pacing uses understanding as a tool to steer behavior without transparency. The difference lies in whether the person would still agree if the intent were fully visible. Breaking the power of pacing and leading requires noticing sequence. When you feel deeply understood and then suddenly guided, pause. Ask yourself, where is this leading, and does this direction truly serve me? Alignment should not remove your ability to question. Pacing and leading works because humans follow those who seem to understand them. Understanding creates trust. Trust creates openness. Openness allows direction. When used ethically, this can help people grow. When used manipulatively, it quietly removes agency. Awareness restores balance. When you stay present and reflective, you can appreciate being understood without surrendering where you are going. The Ben Franklin Effect. The Ben Franklin Effect is a psychological phenomenon where people tend to like someone more after doing them a favor rather than the other way around. This idea may seem counterintuitive at first. Most people assume that we help those we already like, but the Ben Franklin Effect shows that the act of helping itself can create liking, attachment, and even loyalty. In dark psychology, this effect can be subtly exploited to build influence and emotional leverage without overt persuasion. The reason this effect works lies in how the human brain handles internal consistency. Humans strongly prefer to see themselves as rational, kind, and coherent. When someone does a favor for another person, the brain looks for an explanation. If the person receiving the favor is not already liked, a conflict appears. The mind asks, why would I help someone I don't like? That question creates psychological discomfort. To resolve it, the brain often changes the attitude instead of questioning the behavior. It concludes, I must like this person, otherwise I wouldn't have helped them. In this way, behavior reshapes belief. This mechanism is closely related to cognitive dissonance. The brain does not enjoy holding conflicting ideas. Helping someone suggests goodwill. If goodwill did not exist before, the brain creates it afterward to restore balance. The shift happens quietly and unconsciously. The person feels warmer, more favorable, or more trusting toward the one they helped without realizing why. Another reason the Ben Franklin effect is powerful is that favors create investment. Even small favors require effort, attention, or time. Once effort is spent, the brain assigns value to the interaction. Humans tend to value what they invest in. This is why effort strengthens attachment. Helping someone, even in a minor way, makes the relationship feel more meaningful. The effect is especially strong when the favor feels voluntary. When people believe they chose to help freely, the brain fully integrates the action into identity. The thought becomes, I'm the kind of person who helps them. That identity-based conclusion strengthens emotional alignment. The helper now sees themselves as connected to the person they assisted. In manipulation contexts, this effect is used by asking for small, harmless favors early in a relationship or interaction. The request is intentionally easy to accept. It may involve advice, a minor task, or a quick favor. Once the person agrees, the psychological shift begins. The manipulator gains goodwill without offering anything in return yet. Importantly, the favor does not need to be large to be effective. In fact, small favors are often more powerful because they feel natural and non-threatening. Large favors may create resentment or awareness. Small favors slip under the radar. The brain does not flag them as significant, but the psychological effect still occurs. Over time, repeated favors deepen the effect. Each favor reinforces the internal narrative that the person is helpful, supportive, or aligned with the other. Saying no later becomes harder. Refusal would conflict with the established self-image. The manipulator benefits from growing compliance without direct pressure. The Ben Franklin effect also explains why people sometimes defend or support individuals or organizations they have sacrificed for. The more someone gives, the more they feel emotionally tied. Admitting that the recipient does not deserve the effort would create painful dissonance. To avoid that pain, the brain doubles down on loyalty. This effect appears in many areas of life. In workplaces, small requests can build allegiance. In relationships, asking for small help can increase attachment. In social or political contexts, participation and contribution strengthen belief. The structure is always the same: action first, belief second. What makes this effect dangerous in dark psychology is that it reverses the normal expectation of consent. Instead of trust leading to help leads to trust. The person believes their feelings develop naturally, not realizing they were shaped by their own behavior. Influence feels self-generated. It is important to note that the Ben Franklin effect is not inherently harmful. It can build cooperation, empathy, and understanding when used ethically. Helping others can genuinely increase connection. The harm appears when the effect is used intentionally to bypass boundaries or extract ongoing compliance. Another subtle aspect is that the favor often shifts power. The person who receives help may gain influence, not because they earned it, but because the helper's brain reinterprets the relationship. This can create imbalance, especially if favors are one-sided. Resisting manipulation through the Ben Franklin effect requires awareness of patterns. Helping someone does not obligate you to like them, trust them, or continue helping. Recognizing that your feelings may be shaped by your actions allows you to separate kindness from commitment. Asking, "Would I still feel this way if I hadn't helped?" or "Is this relationship balanced?" helps restore clarity. Kindness should be a choice, not a trap. The Ben Franklin effect works because humans want their actions and beliefs to align. It turns generosity into attachment. Understanding this effect does not mean becoming less helpful. It means staying conscious of how your own behavior can quietly shape your emotions and loyalties. When awareness is present, help remains a gift, not a lever. Forced commitment. Forced commitment is a psychological manipulation tactic that works by pushing someone to publicly agree, commit, or take a visible stance before they have fully evaluated what they are agreeing to. Once the commitment is made, social pressure, identity, and consistency lock the person in. The power of this tactic does not come from the commitment itself, but from what happens after. The person feels compelled to continue, defend, or escalate their involvement, even if doubts appear later. Humans place enormous value on consistency. We want our actions, words, and self-image to align. When someone commits publicly, the brain treats that commitment as part of identity. Backing out would create discomfort, embarrassment, or a sense of failure. Forced commitment exploits this by securing an early yes, "I'm under conditions that minimize reflection and maximize visibility. The commitment is often framed as harmless or symbolic. It may involve signing something small, agreeing verbally in front of others, stating a preference, clicking "I agree," or making a public declaration. At the moment, it feels minor. But psychologically, it creates a line. Once crossed, the brain reframes future choices around staying consistent with that line. One reason forced commitment is effective is social accountability. When other people witness the commitment, the pressure intensifies. Humans fear being seen as unreliable, weak, or hypocritical. Even if no one explicitly judges them, the imagined judgment is enough. The brain anticipates social consequences and chooses compliance to avoid them. Another mechanism at work is identity fusion. The commitment is often framed in moral, personal, or value-based terms. Statements like, "People like you usually support this," or "This says something about who you are," link the action to self-image. Once identity is involved, changing course feels like changing who you are. The brain resists that shift strongly. Forced commitment also works by reducing future choice. After committing, the options narrow. The person no longer asks, "Do I want this?" They ask, "How do I justify what I already agreed to?" The decision-making frame shifts from evaluation to defense. The mind becomes focused on protecting the commitment rather than reassessing it. This tactic often appears in sequences. First comes a public agreement, then come increasing demands, expectations, or responsibilities. Each new step is framed as a natural continuation of the original commitment. Saying no later feels harder than saying no at the start would have been. The manipulator benefits from momentum. Forced commitment is especially effective when paired with time pressure, authority, or social proof. When people feel rushed, defer to authority, or believe others have already committed, they are more likely to agree quickly. Once the commitment is made, the external pressure is no longer needed. Internal pressure takes over. In workplaces, forced commitment may involve public goals, verbal promises in meetings, or early buy-in before details are clear. In relationships, it may involve labels, declarations, or public alignment before trust is established. In marketing or persuasion, it may involve trials, pledges, or symbolic acts that later justify larger commitments. The structure is always the same: commit now, think later. Another reason this tactic works is that people confuse commitment with integrity. Staying consistent feels morally right. Changing one's mind feels like weakness. Manipulators exploit this by framing reconsideration as disloyalty or failure. The person stays committed not because the choice is still right, but because leaving feels wrong. Forced commitment also creates cognitive investment. Once effort, time, or reputation has been spent, the brain assigns value to the commitment. This is related to the sunk cost effect. The more someone has invested, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when walking away would be healthier. What makes forced commitment dangerous is that consent is front-loaded and incomplete. The person agrees before fully understanding consequences. Later, when clarity arrives, the social and psychological cost of reversing course feels too high. The commitment becomes a trap. It is important to distinguish forced commitment from voluntary commitment. Voluntary commitment is informed, reversible, and aligned with personal values. Forced commitment is rushed, public, and designed to limit exit. The difference lies in timing, transparency, and pressure. Breaking the power of forced commitment requires reclaiming the right to revise decisions. Changing your mind is not failure. It is responsiveness to new information. Asking, "If I hadn't already committed, would I choose this now?" helps separate present truth from past pressure. Creating private decision space also helps. Commitments made quietly and reflectively are easier to reassess honestly. Public commitments should be made only after understanding full implications. Forced commitment works because humans fear inconsistency more than misalignment. It turns early agreement into ongoing compliance. Understanding this tactic restores the freedom to pause, reconsider, and choose again. A commitment should reflect who you are now, not who you felt pressured to be then. False consensus effect. The false consensus effect is a psychological phenomenon where people are led to believe that their opinions, beliefs, behaviors, or choices are far more widely shared than they actually are. In dark psychology, this effect is exploited deliberately to make someone feel that agreement is normal, expected, and socially validated. When a person believes that most people think this way, resistance weakens, doubt feels isolating, and conformity feels safe. At its core, the false consensus effect plays on a deep human fear, being alone in belief. Humans evolved in groups where exclusion meant danger. Because of this, the brain is highly sensitive to perceived majority opinion. When people think they are aligned with the group, they feel secure. When they think they are outside it, anxiety increases. Manipulators use this instinct to guide beliefs and behavior without direct force. The effect works by exaggerating agreement and minimizing dissent. Statements like, "Everyone agrees," "Most people feel this way," "No one has a problem with this," or "This is just common sense," are classic triggers. These claims are rarely supported by evidence, but the brain often does not ask for proof. The emotional weight of perceived consensus is enough. One reason the false consensus effect is so powerful is that humans naturally project their own beliefs onto others. We assume that what feels obvious to us must feel obvious to everyone else. Manipulators amplify this tendency by reinforcing the idea of widespread agreement. Once reinforced externally, the belief feels even more solid. The person stops questioning not because the idea is correct, but because disagreement feels socially risky. This effect also works by silencing opposition. When someone believes they are in the minority, they are less likely to speak up. Silence is then interpreted as agreement, which further strengthens the illusion of consensus. Over time, a false belief can appear dominant simply because those who disagree feel uncomfortable expressing it. The manipulator benefits from this self-reinforcing loop. The false consensus effect is especially effective in emotionally charged or ambiguous situations. When facts are unclear, people look to others for guidance. If a manipulator presents their view as the dominant one, the brain uses that as a shortcut. Instead of analyzing evidence, it asks, what do people like me usually think? That question favors conformity over truth. This tactic is often paired with vague group references. The manipulator may refer to people, experts, most customers, the team, or everyone else, without specifying who these groups actually are. The lack of specificity prevents verification while still triggering social pressure. The brain fills in the gaps with imagined approval. In relationships, the false consensus effect may sound like, anyone would agree with me, or you're the only one who sees it this way. This reframes disagreement as abnormal. The target may begin doubting their perception, not because it is wrong, but because it appears isolated. The desire to restore normalcy pushes them toward compliance. In workplaces, this effect may appear as, we're all on the same page, even when no real discussion occurred. Employees may suppress concerns to avoid being seen as difficult. In social or political contexts, repeated claims of majority opinion can shape beliefs even without data. People often align with what they think others believe, not with what they personally verify. Another reason the false consensus effect works is that agreement feels validating. When people believe their view is shared, they feel confident and justified. Manipulators exploit this by presenting their position as already accepted. The person does not feel persuaded, they feel reassured. The effect also interacts with identity. When beliefs are tied to group belonging, disagreement threatens identity, not just opinion. Manipulators frame consensus as a marker of belonging. To disagree feels like stepping outside the group. The brain resists that strongly. What makes the false consensus effect dangerous is that it distorts reality without needing lies. The manipulator does not need to prove consensus exists, they only need to suggest it confidently. The brain does the rest. Over time, repeated claims of consensus can reshape norms, silence diversity of thought, and normalize harmful ideas. It is important to note that true consensus does exist in some cases. The manipulation lies in presenting consensus where there is none, or exaggerating it to suppress thought. Healthy consensus invites dialogue. False consensus shuts it down. Resisting this effect requires asking specific questions. Who exactly agrees? How do we know? Are there other perspectives? Naming the imagined group often exposes how vague the claim is. Independent verification breaks the illusion. Understanding that disagreement does not equal isolation is crucial. Many people stay silent, not because they agree, but because they feel alone. Silence is not proof. The false consensus effect works because humans crave belonging more than certainty. It turns imagined agreement into pressure. Recognizing this restores the freedom to think independently. Truth does not require everyone to agree. When you stop measuring your beliefs by perceived popularity, you regain clarity and confidence in your own judgment. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is a psychological mechanism where a behavior is strengthened not by giving a reward, but by removing something unpleasant. The key idea is relief. When an action makes discomfort, stress, fear, or pressure stop, the brain learns to repeat that action. Over time, the behavior becomes automatic, not because it feels good, but because it prevents something bad from happening. In dark psychology, negative reinforcement is often used deliberately to control behavior by creating discomfort and positioning compliance as the only escape. To understand negative reinforcement, it is important to separate it from punishment. Punishment adds something unpleasant to stop a behavior. Negative reinforcement removes something unpleasant to encourage a behavior. This distinction matters because negative reinforcement often feels like kindness or relief, even though it is driving control. The brain focuses on the relief and ignores the manipulation that caused the discomfort in the first place. The human nervous system is highly sensitive to discomfort. Stress, anxiety, social tension, criticism, silence, pressure, or emotional coldness all activate the threat system. When that discomfort disappears, the brain experiences relief. That relief is powerful. Dopamine is released, not because something positive was gained, but because a negative state ended. The brain quickly links the behavior that preceded the relief to safety. Negative reinforcement works because the brain is motivated more strongly by avoiding pain than by seeking pleasure. Relief feels urgent and necessary. When a specific action reliably removes discomfort, the brain prioritizes it. Over time, the person may not even notice they are acting to avoid discomfort. The behavior feels natural, logical, or responsible, even when it is rooted in fear. In manipulation contexts, discomfort is often subtle and psychological rather than physical. It may involve tension, disapproval, emotional withdrawal, criticism, or implied consequences. The manipulator creates or allows this discomfort to exist. When the target complies, the discomfort stops. The silence ends. The tension lifts. Approval returns. The brain learns the pattern quickly. One reason negative reinforcement is so powerful is that it trains behavior without overt force. The manipulator does not need to threaten explicitly. The discomfort speaks for itself. The target learns, when I do this, things are calm. When I don't, things feel bad. Over time, compliance becomes self-enforced. The person changes behavior to maintain peace, not because they want to, but because they want relief. Negative reinforcement is especially effective in close relationships and hierarchical environments. In relationships, it may look like affection returning only after apology, compliance, or silence. In workplaces, it may involve pressure easing only when extra work is accepted. In families, it may involve approval returning only when expectations are met. The behavior is shaped quietly through cycles of discomfort and relief. Another reason this mechanism is so difficult to break is that relief feels like reward. The brain misinterprets the situation. It does not register that the discomfort was unnecessary or manipulated. It only registers that compliance worked. This creates loyalty to the pattern. The person may even defend it, saying things like, "It's just easier this way," or "This keeps things smooth." Negative reinforcement also creates anxiety. Because relief depends on behavior, the person becomes vigilant. They try to anticipate what will prevent discomfort. This leads to overthinking, people-pleasing, and self-censorship. The nervous system stays on alert, scanning for potential triggers. Calm is conditional, not stable. Over time, this pattern can erode boundaries and self-trust. The person learns to prioritize avoiding discomfort over expressing needs or values. They may stop asking what they want and focus instead on what will keep things calm. The manipulator gains control not through dominance, but through conditioning. Importantly, negative reinforcement does not require conscious intent to be harmful, but in dark psychology, it is often used deliberately. The manipulator understands that relief is powerful and uses it strategically. They withdraw comfort, approval, or ease, and then restore it when behavior aligns with their goals. It is important to distinguish negative reinforcement from healthy feedback. In healthy systems, discomfort is addressed directly, explained clearly, and resolved through communication. Relief does not depend on submission. In manipulative systems, discomfort is vague, unexplained, and only resolved through compliance. That difference defines the harm. Breaking the power of negative reinforcement requires noticing patterns, not moments. Relief after compliance can feel convincing, but the larger pattern reveals control. Asking what discomfort is being removed and why was it there to begin with helps restore perspective. Creating tolerance for temporary discomfort also weakens the mechanism. When someone can sit with tension without immediately fixing it through compliance, the conditioning loses strength. Relief no longer controls behavior. Negative reinforcement works because humans are wired to seek safety and avoid distress. It turns relief into a leash. Understanding this mechanism restores the ability to choose based on values rather than avoidance. Calm should come from mutual respect, not from walking on emotional landmines. When relief is no longer the reward, control disappears. The decoy effect. The decoy effect is a psychological manipulation tactic that influences decisions by introducing a third option designed not to be chosen, but to make another option seem more attractive. The decoy is intentionally inferior in a specific way, so that one of the original options appears clearly superior by comparison. The power of this effect lies in how the human brain compares choices. People rarely evaluate options in isolation. They evaluate them relative to each other, and the decoy quietly reshapes that comparison. The human brain is not naturally good at making absolute judgments. Faced with multiple options, it looks for shortcuts to decide what feels best. One of the strongest shortcuts is relative comparison. Instead of asking, "What do I really want?" the brain asks, "Which option looks better than the others?" The decoy effect exploits this tendency by manipulating the reference point. In a typical decoy setup, there are two main options. One might be cheaper but lower quality, and the other more expensive but higher quality. On their own, the choice might be difficult. The decoy is then introduced. It closely resembles one of the options, but is clearly worse in a key aspect, such as being more expensive without offering much more value. This makes the similar option look like an obvious deal, even if it wasn't before. What makes the decoy effect powerful is that the decoy does not need to be chosen. Its only purpose is to guide perception. Once the decoy is present, the brain stops comparing all options equally. It focuses on the contrast between the decoy and the target option. The target feels safer, smarter, and more reasonable, even if nothing about it has changed. The brain responds strongly to dominance. When one option appears clearly better than another similar option, it triggers confidence. The person feels like the choice is logical and justified. This confidence is important. Humans dislike uncertainty. The decoy creates a sense of clarity by simplifying the decision. The brain relaxes and commits. Another reason the decoy effect works is that it reduces internal conflict. Without the decoy, the person may feel torn between trade-offs. With the decoy present, one option stands out. The discomfort of indecision fades. The person feels decisive, even though that decisiveness was engineered. The decoy effect also exploits the desire to feel rational. When the target option dominates the decoy, choosing it feels intelligent. The person believes they are making a smart comparison-based decision. They do not feel manipulated. They feel clever. This is one of the reasons the effect is difficult to detect. This tactic is commonly used in pricing, marketing, negotiations, and persuasion. In pricing, a third option is introduced to make a higher-priced option look like better value. In negotiations, an extreme or inferior proposal may be added to push acceptance of a preferred outcome. In persuasion, an obviously flawed alternative may be mentioned to make the desired option feel sensible by contrast. The decoy effect works even when people are aware that choices are being framed. Knowing that options are designed strategically does not fully protect against the effect. The comparison happens automatically. The brain responds before conscious reasoning can intervene. Emotion also plays a role. When a choice feels clearer, anxiety drops, relief appears. That emotional shift reinforces the decision. The person associates the chosen option with comfort and certainty. This emotional reinforcement strengthens commitment. Another subtle aspect of the decoy effect is that it changes what people value. Before the decoy, different attributes may matter equally. After the decoy is introduced, the brain focuses on the attribute where the target dominates. Other attributes fade into the background. The decoy guides not just choice, but priorities. The decoy effect can also be used in non-commercial contexts. In relationships or workplaces, a less desirable comparison may be introduced to make a situation or demand seem reasonable. For example, presenting an extreme alternative makes a still unfair option feel acceptable. The person agrees, not because it is fair, but because it is better than the decoy. What makes the decoy effect dangerous in dark psychology is that it shapes choice without changing reality. The options are the same. Only the comparison changed. The person's sense of autonomy remains intact, but their evaluation process was quietly guided. It is important to understand that the decoy effect does not rely on deception in the traditional sense. The decoy can be real. The manipulation lies in intentional design. The environment is structured to push a predictable outcome. Resisting the decoy effect requires stepping back and isolating options. Asking, "Would I still choose this if the decoy were removed?" helps reset judgment. Comparing options to personal needs instead of to each other restores clarity. Time also weakens the effect, because emotional clarity fades and independent evaluation returns. The decoy effect works because humans seek simplicity, confidence, and relative advantage. It turns comparison into control. Understanding this mechanism restores the ability to choose based on true value rather than manipulated contrast. When options are judged on their own merits, decoys lose their power. Planned vulnerability. Planned vulnerability is a psychological manipulation tactic where someone deliberately reveals selective weaknesses, emotions, or personal struggles in order to build trust, lower defenses, and create emotional leverage. On the surface, it looks like honesty, openness, or courage. But unlike genuine vulnerability, planned vulnerability is calculated. What is shared is chosen carefully, timed strategically, and used to guide how the other person feels, responds, or commits. Humans are deeply responsive to vulnerability. When someone opens up, our brains interpret it as a signal of trust. That signal activates empathy, warmth, and connection. We feel closer to people who share personal struggles because openness usually carries risk. Evolutionarily, revealing weakness meant trusting that the other person would not exploit it. Because of this, vulnerability feels rare, valuable, and bonding. Planned vulnerability exploits that instinct. The key difference between genuine vulnerability and planned vulnerability lies in intent and balance. Genuine vulnerability is about mutual understanding, emotional honesty, and connection without expectation of control. Planned vulnerability is about influence. The manipulator shares just enough to appear authentic, but not enough to be truly exposed. The information revealed is safe, controlled, and designed to produce a predictable emotional response. One reason planned vulnerability is so effective is that it flips power dynamics quietly. When someone shares a personal struggle, the listener often feels honored, trusted, or chosen. This creates emotional investment. The listener may feel responsible for supporting, protecting, or understanding the person. That sense of responsibility can later be used to extract compliance, loyalty, or forgiveness. Planned vulnerability often appears early in relationships or interactions. The timing is important. When vulnerability appears before trust has naturally developed, it accelerates emotional closeness. The brain mistakes speed for depth. The connection feels intense and meaningful, even though it has not been tested by time or consistency. This fast bond lowers skepticism. Another powerful element of planned vulnerability is selective framing. The manipulator often presents themselves as self-aware, wounded, misunderstood, or striving to improve. This creates a narrative of growth or redemption. The listener may feel inspired or empathetic. Criticism becomes harder because it feels like attacking someone who is trying or opening up. Planned vulnerability also discourages boundaries. When someone shares something personal, setting limits afterward can feel cruel or dismissive. The listener may think, "They trusted me with this, so I shouldn't push back." The manipulator benefits from this hesitation. Emotional openness becomes a shield against accountability. This tactic is often paired with subtle requests or expectations. After sharing vulnerability, the manipulator may ask for patience, understanding, exceptions, or special treatment. The request feels reasonable because it follows emotional disclosure. The brain connects support with compliance. Saying no feels like rejecting the person, not just the request. Planned vulnerability can also create imbalance. The manipulator shares strategically while encouraging the other person to share deeply and openly. This creates asymmetry. The manipulator gains emotional information and leverage while remaining relatively protected. The relationship feels intimate, but control flows in one direction. In dark psychology, planned vulnerability is often used to soften resistance. Before confronting, persuading, or asking for commitment, the manipulator reveals something personal. The listener's defenses drop. Emotional focus replaces analytical thinking. The conversation shifts from, "Is this right?" to "I want to be supportive." This tactic is especially effective on empathetic, caring, or emotionally intelligent people. Their strength becomes the entry point. The desire to understand and help is used against them. Over time, they may tolerate behavior they would otherwise challenge because they feel connected to the person's story. Planned vulnerability is common in relationships, leadership, persuasion, and influence building. In relationships, it may be used to excuse harmful behavior. In workplaces, it may be used to gain loyalty or bypass critique. In social influence, it may be used to build a following by appearing relatable and human while maintaining control. What makes planned vulnerability dangerous is that it feels good. It feels honest, human, and connective. People are less likely to question it because questioning vulnerability feels heartless. The manipulation hides inside emotional sincerity. It is important to understand that vulnerability itself is not bad. In fact, it is essential for healthy connection. The harm appears when vulnerability is used as a tactic rather than an expression. Genuine vulnerability invites reciprocity but does not demand it. Planned vulnerability creates obligation. One way to recognize planned vulnerability is to observe patterns. Does vulnerability appear primarily when accountability, boundaries, or persuasion are involved? Does openness disappear when consequences arise? Does the vulnerability lead to repeated requests for tolerance or exceptions? Patterns reveal intent more clearly than single moments. Resisting this tactic does not require emotional shutdown. It requires grounded empathy. You can care without surrendering judgment. Asking, "What is being asked of me after this disclosure?" helps separate compassion from compliance. True vulnerability stands on its own. It does not need leverage. Planned vulnerability works because humans equate openness with trustworthiness. It turns emotional sharing into influence. Understanding this tactic allows you to remain compassionate without being guided by selective disclosure. Real connection grows through consistency, not confession. When vulnerability is genuine, it deepens respect. When it is planned, it quietly redirects power. Deliberate misinterpretation. Deliberate misinterpretation is a psychological manipulation tactic where someone intentionally twists, oversimplifies, or falsely reframes another person's words, intentions, or feelings in order to gain control of the interaction. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a choice. The goal is to derail the conversation, shift blame, avoid accountability, or provoke confusion and emotional exhaustion in the other person. By changing what was meant into something easier to attack or dismiss, the manipulator gains leverage. Humans rely on shared meaning to communicate. When someone deliberately misinterprets what we say, it disrupts that foundation. The brain expects good faith in conversation. When that expectation is violated, confusion appears. The person starts trying to clarify, explain, or defend themselves. That effort drains emotional and cognitive energy. Deliberate misinterpretation exploits this drain. This tactic often begins subtly. A clear statement is reframed into an exaggerated or distorted version. For example, a concern becomes an accusation, a boundary becomes rejection, a feeling becomes an attack. The manipulator responds not to what was actually said, but to a warped version of it. The target immediately feels misunderstood and compelled to correct the distortion. One reason deliberate misinterpretation is so effective is that it shifts the burden of proof. Instead of addressing the original issue, the conversation becomes about defending intent. The target is forced into a reactive position. They are no longer expressing a need or concern. They are explaining why they are not unreasonable, cruel, or irrational. This reversal gives the manipulator control of the narrative. Another powerful mechanism involved is emotional escalation. When someone feels persistently misunderstood, frustration rises. The manipulator may then point to that frustration as evidence that the target is overreacting or emotional. This creates a loop. The more the target tries to clarify, the more emotionally charged the interaction becomes, reinforcing the manipulator's framing. Deliberate misinterpretation also works by exhausting language. Words lose meaning when they are constantly twisted. The target may begin doubting their ability to communicate clearly. They may over-explain, soften statements, or stop speaking altogether. Silence then replaces expression, which benefits the manipulator. The absence of challenge feels like agreement. This tactic is especially common when someone wants to avoid accountability. Instead of addressing a valid concern, the manipulator reframes it into something absurd or extreme. By arguing against the distortion, they avoid engaging with the real issue. The original point disappears under layers of misrepresentation. Deliberate misinterpretation is often paired with mockery or false innocence. The manipulator may say things like, "So you're saying I'm a terrible person?" or, "Wow, I guess nothing I do is ever enough." These responses exaggerate the message into something unreasonable. The target feels forced to backpedal, reassure, or apologize, even though that was never their intent. This tactic also undermines trust in communication. When someone consistently misinterprets, the target learns that speaking honestly leads to conflict, confusion, or punishment. Over time, they may self-censor. They choose emotional safety over clarity. This erodes autonomy and authentic expression. Deliberate misinterpretation is particularly damaging in close relationships, workplaces, and authority dynamics. In relationships, it can turn vulnerability into conflict. In workplaces, it can silence feedback. In authority contexts, it can delegitimize dissent. The person being misinterpreted feels unheard and powerless, even though they are speaking clearly. Another reason this tactic works is that it creates plausible deniability. The manipulator can claim they simply understood it differently. This makes the behavior difficult to call out. The harm is real, but intent is hidden. The target may even start questioning whether they are communicating poorly rather than recognizing the pattern. This manipulation also shifts focus away from facts and toward tone and intent. The manipulator may argue about how something was said rather than what was said. This derails progress. The conversation becomes circular. Nothing gets resolved. Over time, repeated deliberate misinterpretation can lead to learned helplessness. The target may feel that no matter how carefully they speak, they will be misunderstood. They stop trying. This silence can be mistaken for compliance or peace, when it is actually emotional withdrawal. It is important to distinguish deliberate misinterpretation from genuine misunderstanding. Genuine misunderstanding invites clarification and resolution. Deliberate misinterpretation resists clarification. The same distortions repeat even after being corrected. Patterns reveal intent. Breaking the power of this tactic involves naming it and refusing to chase distortions. Calmly restating the original point and refusing to argue against exaggerated interpretations helps shift control. Statements like, "That's not what I said," followed by repeating the original message, prevent derailment. If the distortion continues, disengagement may be necessary. Deliberate misinterpretation works because humans want to be understood. It turns that need into a weapon. Understanding this tactic restores clarity and self-trust. You are not obligated to defend meanings you never expressed. Communication should clarify, not confuse. When words are twisted repeatedly, the problem is not expression, it is manipulation.